What if a single second could stretch into a century? What if, for one fleeting heartbeat near an abyss, the universe beyond appeared to accelerate, years collapsing into a whisper while the observer remained suspended in a kind of merciless present? It is not a parable or a thought experiment invented for cinema, it is the literal prediction of the equations that govern gravity. Black holes, the cosmic sinks that are usually described as ravenous mouths devouring light and matter, do something stranger still. They bend time itself. On the edge of a black hole, time does not merely slow down in a poetic sense, it dilates, close to an event horizon, the notional boundary beyond which nothing returns. The relationship between clocks diverges. An observer who manages to hover infinitesimally above that border will find their seconds stretched, elongated by the gravity well so profoundly that an outsider watching from a safe distance would perceive those seconds as years, centuries, or longer. The deeper the gravity, the greater the discrepancy. It is as if the flow of time is being siphoned into the black hole's geometry where causality acquires an unfamiliar shape. To imagine that place is to imagine time as a river that can be narrowed to a thread. Above the river, life flows at the pace common to the distant bank, seasons, rising and setting suns, the slow accretion of continents. At the river's constriction, at the edge where space-time is taut like a taut fabric, currents slow and pool. A clock held there would tick with excruciating deliberation. The atoms in its mechanism would march on, but for those looking back from the bank, those ticks would be separated by yawning spans. One could live an ordinary minute in that strangled zone while millennia pass in the wider world. The experience is both hypnotic and grotesque, a kind of temporal isolation that magnifies loneliness into a cosmic sensation. The mathematics behind this is elegantly unyielding. General relativity teaches that gravity is not a force in the Newtonian sense, but the curvature of spacetime itself. Mass and energy tell spacetime how to curve, spacetime tells matter how to move, close to an immense concentration of mass. For instance, the supermassive black holes that sit at the centers of galaxies. This curvature becomes extreme. Time, in the relativistic sense, is one of the dimensions being curved. A clock near that mass records a different amount of proper time than a clock far away. This is not metaphor, this is measurement. The GPS satellites that guide everyday navigation must correct for relativistic time shifts near a black hole. The effect is amplified until ordinary. There is an emotional grammar to this physics. When confronted with the idea that time can be stretched and severed, human reactions coalesce into familiar currents. Awe at the immensity of scales, dread at the tiny arc of human history, a peculiar longing for continuity in a universe that seems capable of tearing its own narrative apart. Imagine standing in a quiet room and knowing that every breath taken there corresponds to centuries of other stories outside. That knowledge would create cognitive turbulence, a tension between presence and absence that reverberates into philosophy as much as into astrophysics. This is why black holes have come to occupy a particular mythic space in human thought. They are not merely engines of destruction, they are seams in the fabric of time, places where the usual rules fray. The event horizon, which to a distant observer appears to freeze in falling objects in an eternal twilight, is a kind of optical memory, the last visible imprint of what plunges in. To an outsider, an object falling toward a black hole appears to slow, redden, and fade, never quite crossing the threshold. To the object itself, crossing is abrupt. The mismatch is one of perspective. Coordinate time freezes at the horizon. Proper time marches inevitably onward. In that fracture, the idea of a unit. What might this mean for deep time? The grand scales that encompass geological epochs, ice ages, the rise and fall of continents, the slow bloom and fade of ecosystems? Earth is already an exemplar of temporal humility. Its history spans roughly 4.5 billion years. Human beings have been writing stories for mere tens of thousands. Civilizations with their monuments and archives are flares in an ocean of tectonic and biological processes. Against that canvas, black holes add a new tier of duration. Supermassive black holes can live for unimaginably long times, and their gravitational influence can warp time in ways that dwarf planetary clocks. The slow evaporation of a black hole through There is a speculative current that flows from these facts. What if black holes are not just places where time stretches, but the very units, or perhaps processors of time? What if, embedded in their event horizons and in the way information is scrambled and eventually released, lies a key to understanding time's origin, its directionality, its asymmetry? The question moves from physical curiosity into philosophical excavation. Time, as experienced, has a direction, past to future. Entropy increases, memories accumulate, causes precede effects. Yet the fundamental laws of physics, apart from statistical considerations, are often time-symmetric. The arrow of time emerges then from boundary conditions and statistical processes. Black holes, with their singular curvature and information, these are not idle musings. The black hole information paradox has catalyzed some of the most profound developments in theoretical physics in the last decades, from ideas about holography, suggesting that the information content of a volume of space may be encoded on its boundary, to bold conjectures proposing that space itself is emergent from quantum entanglement. When time is placed within that mix, weird and beautiful possibilities arise. If space can be emergent, might time be as well? Might the slow ticking of deep cosmological clocks be a macroscopic manifestation of microscopic quantum processes localized, astonishingly, at horizons? The thought ties into broader speculations about whether the laws of cause and effect are fundamental or derivative, whether the flow of. Within that speculative territory, the emotional stakes are unmistakable. The idea that time might be a kind of inscription or computation written in the geometry of horizons, in the dance of quantum bits, renders human history both fragile and precious. If time itself can be bent and localized, if the past can be blurred at the margins of a black hole while the outside world accelerates forward, then the preservation of narrative becomes an act of extraordinary difficulty. The ruins of an ancient civilization, washed away by ice or buried under meters of silt, are already victims of time's inexorable erosion. Imagine, then, cultures erased not by local processes, but by the differential flow of time itself, pockets where days corresponded to eras elsewhere, where a fleeting. Black holes, in this speculative documentary, become repositories of paradox and memory. The event horizon, cold and dark from afar, is also the speaking surface of the universe's bookkeeping. Information that falls in might be scrambled, yet in principle preserved. A palimpsest whose future revelation, perhaps in Hawking radiation over timescales beyond comprehension, would be a kind of cosmic delayed justice. There is a melancholic beauty to this, that the universe might conserve its stories, but only in a form that requires patience beyond the scope of life and civilization. The slow leak of encoded information from evaporating black holes is akin to a library whose volumes can be read only when the sun itself has long gone out. There is also an ethical dimension to the thought experiment. If an observer could survive close to an event horizon, their subjective present might be stretched to an extent that trivializes human timescales. Loved ones and cities would age into dust while they remained. To choose to linger in that zone would be to opt out of synchronic social life, to exchange participation in communal history for an intimate, though isolating, observation of distant epochs. The compulsion to peer into the future, to witness the end of eras, is a human trait writ large against a gravitational backdrop. That compulsion is balanced by an equally human dread, the fear of becoming out of time, of having personal experience decoupled from the shared present that binds communities and identities. It is tempting, in speculative moments, to turn the notion toward futurism. Could black holes be harnessed as temporal engines, as refuges for minds that wish to leap forward into ages untouched by present decay? Practicalities intervene. The tidal forces near small black holes would shred any material object. Only supermassive black holes have gentle enough gradients to allow a theoretical approach. The energies, the engineering demands, and the ethical quandaries form a barrier at least as real as any horizon. But the lure remains, a natural phenomenon that rearranges the metric of time itself, suggests pathways to thinking about preservation, delay, and the staggering variety of temporal architectures that a universe. As the narrator of this speculative documentary, one must also insist upon humility. Much of this terrain sits at the frontier between robust theory and metaphoric extension. General relativity provides the stage. Quantum gravity remains the playwright still missing a script. What happens at the singularity, or in the deep quantum regime where spacetime ceases to be smooth, is still largely an unknown. The language of time breaking is useful because it evokes the discontinuities that the math implies, places where the continuous narrative of cause and effect enters a region that ordinary intuition cannot map. Yet science demands restraint. The most interesting conjectures emerge not from cinematic leaps, but from rigorous attempts to and so the place where time breaks is both a physical location and an intellectual crucible. It is the event horizon and the singularity, the theater where gravity and quantum uncertainty clash. It is the scale at which human concerns, memory, loss, legacy, shrink into a kind of cosmic ephemera. It calls forth philosophical questions about what it means to persist, to be remembered, to be included in the ledger of the universe. If black holes, in some deep way, are the key to time itself, then the key is less a device to be used than a mirror held to human finitude. It forces a reckoning with the fact that durations that feel permanent are not, that epochs will pass and civilizations will collapse, and that the cosmos keeps its own. Time near a black hole is not a theater of miracles where past and future are merely shuffled at will. It is, instead, a frontier where familiar metaphors for continuity begin to fray. The place where time breaks is a place of extremity, of mathematical clarity and philosophical opacity, where a minute can become a millennium, and where the future arrives at a pace that renders present concerns ephemeral. For those who study it, the black hole is an instrument of inquiry into the structure of reality. For those who imagine its implications, it is a landscape of stories, some yet to be told, some perhaps locked away for durations that exceed the patience of species. And for anyone who listens to the whispered calculations and the slow music of orbiting clocks, it is a what does it mean, at its deepest, to say that time is no longer absolute? The question is not merely about clocks losing their unanimity, it is about the unraveling of a tacit promise that had underpinned centuries of human thought. The promise that there exists a single, universal cadence to which the cosmos and its stories might all be tuned. Einstein removed that promise. Gravity, in his equations, acquired the power not only to bend space, but to stretch and compress time itself, so that two identical clocks, placed at different depths in a gravitational well, will refuse to agree on how many heartbeats the world has taken. The physics can be described with calm succinctness, mass curves, space-time, and within that curvature the rate at which proper time is experienced depends on location in the field. But calm descriptions mask the strangeness. Imagine standing at the lip of a well whose walls are the geometry of the universe. The deeper the well, the more sluggish the local seconds become, compared to the distant rim. Near a black hole, an object so dense and compact that it makes space-time fold inward to an extreme, the well becomes a canyon. The flow of moments there is nearly arrested, not by any mystical force, but by the mathematics that tie time to curvature. A minute measured just above the event horizon can correspond to a century recorded by a clock. Say, this is not poetry alone. It is the literal prediction of an exact theory. Consider how ordinary life already carries this signature of relativity. Atomic clocks placed at different altitudes disagree by measurable fractions of a second. Engineers who design navigation systems correct satellite time for both special and general relativistic effects. Without those corrections, GPS would drift catastrophically. These are quotidian reminders that time's rate is conditional, responsive to motion and mass. Now scale the phenomenon up, not by decimal places but by orders of magnitude, until the corrections stop being matters of engineering and become the fabric of a radically different experience of duration. To appreciate the human scale of such dilation, the mind must lean on imagery. A clock is more than gears and numbers, it is an instrument of narrative. Each tick is a sentence in the story of a life. The particular cruelty of gravitational time dilation near a black hole is that the sentences of the near horizon present are stretched into enormous essays for the outside universe. From far away, those ticks are rare and faint. An object falling toward the horizon seems to crawl, reddening, its last light stretched into the long wavelength hush of an eternal sunset. But for the local clock, the mechanism knows nothing of cosmic judgment. Its springs unwind with the same mechanical determinism. The disagreement is a matter of perspective. That optical consequence, redshift, is central to the mental picture. Light climbing out of a gravitational well loses energy. Photons that leave the region near a horizon are elongated. Their wavelengths are pulled to the red, carrying away not only energy, but a record of where they came from. To a distant observer, the image of anything approaching the horizon fades into a smeared afterimage that never quite crosses the boundary. Contrast this with the internal perspective, where crossing is sudden, perhaps terminal. The paradox dissolves when the two viewpoints are correctly framed. One watches coordinate time, the other lives proper time. The universe, then, tolerates plurality where once it promised uniformity. There is a peculiar cruelty and a peculiar generosity in that plurality. Cruelty, because to linger near the gravitational abyss is to be extruded from the shared calendar of civilization. Suppose a hypothetical instrument could hover in the slow time pocket. Its sensors would record the outside world accelerating, cities aging, oceans changing, wars and seasons telescoped into a blur. 1 minute in the slow pocket could correspond to decades, centuries, even millennia beyond. The personified image is evocative, a being who keeps careful notes in the present while the planet outside moves through epochs. The generosity is more subtle. The gravitational well offers, in effect, a magnification of timelines. Civilizational processes that take centuries to resolve become observable, yet practicalities reassert themselves. The universe is not a benevolent clockmaker willing to adjust its tempo for the convenience of curiosity. The ramp into the well is littered with hazards. Tidal forces, differences in gravity over small distances, tear at structure. Near modest black holes, these gradients are lethal. Any macroscopic object would be stretched and compressed in a process evocatively called spaghettification. Only the most massive black holes, supermassive giants that sit leisurely at galactic centers, have tidal gradients at the horizon, gentle enough that an extended object could, in theory, approach without immediate disintegration. Even then, the overall engineering required to place and maintain an instrument at a precious infinitesimal distance above the. Still, physics pays no mind to practicalities when it has something profound to teach. The mathematics that describe gravitational time dilation are elegant because they are blunt. They expose a deep dissociation between local experience, proper time, and the coordinate systems humans impose to keep track of the world. A distant cosmologist measuring the age of the universe constructs a narrative stratified by simultaneity slices. But near a black hole, those slices are twisted. Simultaneous events from the distant observer's perspective may be far separated in the local proper time of a near-horizon observer and vice versa. The lesson is unsettlingly democratic. Reality does not privilege any single slicing of spacetime as the absolute chronicle. Time, at least in Einstein, this plurality has implications that bleed into philosophy, ethics, and the speculative anthropology of survivability. When one accepts that the pace of time can be stamped upon by gravity, the very notion of being in the same epoch loses its simplicity. Imagine archives designed not solely to withstand corrosion and oxidation, but to endure temporal mismatch. A book left near a black hole's slow time pocket might remain readable in its local present for what the outside world would count as centuries, perhaps preserving cultures across geological cataclysms. Conversely, a community choosing to place its memory near such a pocket chooses a kind of temporal exile. Their present will no longer be the present of their contemporaries. Their rituals and griefs will. There is a moral paradox in that hypothetical. Preservation through dilation could be framed as rescue-saving stories from the erosive tendencies of entropy and history. Yet it could also be read as abandonment sequestering knowledge in a place where retrieval by the living is made impractical by the deliberate desynchronization of timescales. The ethics is not theoretical ornamentation, it is a sharpened question about responsibility across durations. Who gets to decide which story should be stretched into the slow fold? Who bears the weight of choosing to synchronize or to diverge? Gravity, it seems, offers not only a physical effect, but a menu of temporal architectures from which civilization might choose. If such choices were ethical, the thinking expands further when one contemplates the information theoretic puzzles around black holes. For decades, physicists have debated the fate of information that falls into a black hole. Is it lost forever, violating quantum mechanics' insistence on unitary evolution? Or is it somehow preserved and later returned, perhaps encoded in Hawking radiation? If the latter, then the event horizon becomes more than a boundary, it becomes a ledger, a surface that records the universe's transactions. In that ledger, time acquires a computational flavor. Filling a black hole with information would be analogous to writing a block of data whose eventual slow leak over timescales that dwarf the current age of the universe would reveal the encoded past. The consequence is a radical reimagining. Such patience is alien to contemporary civilization. Human time horizons are short, shaped by electoral cycles, market quarters, and the lifespan of media. To imagine acting for a black hole scale future requires a mentality that places its bets on processes with returns measured in orders of magnitude beyond human lifetimes. Yet ecological and planetary thinking already nudges in this direction. Consider the ambition of geological stewardship plans to store nuclear waste for tens of millennia, or the practices of sea vaults designed to survive epochs. Gravity's dilation adds a dimension to these activities, a place where the archive itself might age negligibly while the outside world moves through eras. The temptation is clear, so are the contradictions. One cannot simply suspend. There is also, in the speculative arena, the seductive language of temporal engineering. If gravity can dilate time, might deliberate manipulations of gravitational fields allow durable timekeeping systems, or even refuges where cognitive systems might outlast planetary decay? Skepticism is warranted. The thermodynamic and quantum realities that coexist with general relativity are not neutral on such projects. Placing a system near a black hole trades one set of vulnerabilities for another. The preservation of a timeline may come at the price of exposure to quantum fluctuations, to the inscrutable dynamics that govern horizons at the Planck scale. Moreover, the act of attempting to harvest or exploit relativistic effects collides with the limits of instrumentation, energy, and the social structures necessary to build and maintain. For the thinkers and storytellers who dwell on deep time, gravitational time dilation offers a framing device that is both awe-inducing and disquieting. It compresses questions of memory, responsibility, and continuity into a single, vivid image, a clock that ticks while the outside world races past. The image serves as a parable and as a technical truth. It evokes the loneliness of a single point of awareness whose experience is betrayed by its own station in a deeper potential. It also reframes the cosmic ledger, not as a simple linear archive, but as a stratified record in which durations are not uniform, but sculpted by gravity's hand. At the heart of this refiguration is an aesthetic lesson about scale and modesty. Earth's deep time, the slow accretion of continents, the ebb and flood of life, already forces a humility. The addition of warping by gravity compounds that humility into an almost metaphysical vertigo. If a minute here can correspond to a century elsewhere, then human timelines are not merely short, they are local. The permanence of any structure, cultural, material, mnemonic, becomes conditional upon where it sits in the gravitational geography of the cosmos. The scientific story remains unfinished. The convergence of general relativity and quantum theory may yet reframe what is meant by time in more radical ways than classical gravitational dilation suggests. But even within the current understanding, the simple, brutal fact that gravity grips the clock is a narrative fulcrum for reflection. It invites a reconsideration of memory, of the ethics of preservation, of the human appetite for witnessing and for holding on to continuity. It offers a stark caution and a luminous possibility that time is not a single river, but a braided system of currents, some rushing, some pooled, and that to narrate the universe is to decide which currents to follow and which to respect from the bank. In the end, the lesson is a double-edged one. Physics teaches that an absolute time was an illusion. Philosophy and culture must reckon with the consequences. The fact that a minute can become a century near a gravitational abyss is at once a technical astonishment and a moral parable. It shows that duration can be manufactured by geometry, that stories can be delayed by gravity's patient hand, and that the ledger of the cosmos is written in a script that sometimes prefers long pauses to swift resolution. For anyone who listens, which is to say, for any civilization that cares about its past and its future, this is not merely a curiosity. It is an invitation to think bigger, slower, and with greater humility about what it means to. What image might best hold the cruelty and the poetry of an event horizon? Imagine a photograph that never quite develops, an outline that approaches fidelity and then, at the last instant, blurs into a smear of long, reddened light. That is the picture the universe offers of its own point of no return. The event horizon is not merely a boundary in space, it is a boundary in narrative, a seam where the common calendar of the cosmos sundered into competing rhythms. From one vantage, objects appear to slow and stall, frozen in an eternal, elegant descent. From another, proper time advances with the same relentless modesty it always has, indifferent to the spectacle. The mathematics give this image an unforgiving clarity. At the horizon, coordinate time, the shared grid, an outside observer uses to mark simultaneity stretches toward infinity. Light climbing out of the gravitational well loses energy, its wavelengths lengthening until color itself becomes testimony to loss. Photons from the brink arrive as whispers, red-shifted until the record of descent thins into an afterglow. To a distant astronomer, the universe keeps a kind of cold memorial. The infalling object never seems to cross, only to fade. To the local clock, measured in proper time crossing is neither drama nor miracle. It is an event, abrupt and unremarkable in its immediacy. This duality carries with it a peculiar psychological gravity. The observer who contemplates this place must reconcile two incompatible intuitions. One intuition insists on a single ledger, a universal present that binds disparate events into one history. The other insists that experience is local, that time's beat can be accelerated or slowed by the curvature of space-time. The event horizon crystallizes that contradiction. It asks a blunt question: which of these intuitions should a thinking being trust when they sit at the boundary between them? There is no easy answer. The universe provides instead a demonstration. The demonstration has an ethical tone. Consider the mental weather that arises when one contemplates being visible but unreachable. An entity whose image is recorded on the cosmic surface, yet whose interior unfolds independently. There is a loneliness intrinsic to being a frozen outline on an external screen while life inside continues, unspectacular. The frozen image functions like a memorial plaque. It commemorates a crossing that the outside never sees completed. It is a form of observational exile. The outside world can watch, immortalize, and analyze the sheen of radiation, but it cannot join the inner chronology. That schism is not merely scientific, it is existential. It reframes what it means to belong. Scientific language softens, but does not erase the visceral sting of that truth. Terms like proper time and coordinate time risk becoming abstractions unless anchored in human-scale metaphors. Imagine a single heartbeat stretched to the length of an ocean tide. Inside the stretched beat, thoughts, sensations, and micro-decisions can accumulate in a concentration their author never experiences elsewhere. Outside, centuries sweep by like weather systems. The contrast is not merely temporal, it is moral. To inhabit a slow pocket, whether by intention or accident, is to opt into a form of stewardship. One becomes, by default, a witness to a future that one cannot fully. The horizon also reorients the notion of visibility. The frozen image that an outside world sees is itself a record of the process of information transfer through extreme curvature. Photons that escape the near-horizon region carry with them encoded signatures of what fell. Those signatures are smeared, energy depleted, and delayed. In a sense, the event horizon acts as a filter scrubbing, stretching, and encrypting the narrative of infall. Information is not simply lost, it is transformed. Whether that information is recoverable in principle is the heart of long-running debates in theoretical physics. The tension between apparent loss and eventual conservation, the information paradox, frames the event horizon not just as there is something almost literary about the ledger metaphor. Records accumulate at the boundary, they are written in radiation, in quantum correlations, in the geometry itself. These records may be indecipherable to contemporaries. The script could be one that requires epochs to decode. The event horizon thus becomes both archive and oubliette. It stores histories in forms that demand patience beyond organic lifespans to retrieve. The thought is sobering. The universe might not erase stories so much as postpone their reading until times when nothing remains to care. That possibility lends a melancholy significance to archaeology on planetary surfaces. If the cosmos has the capacity to hide narratives in slow decaying channels, then the acts of preservation familiar to human cultures take on. That melancholy bleeds into strategy. If an archive could be encoded at a horizon, would anyone choose to place their stories there? The temptation is evident, the promise is seductive, a place where time, for the record, crawls while entropy rages elsewhere. But the temptation collides with profound costs. Tidal forces threaten structure, quantum uncertainties haunt every attempt at deterministic storage, and the timescales involved exceed the endurance of habit, institution, and perhaps even reason. Moreover, by choosing to shelter memory at a horizon, one elects not to participate in the shared present. Preservation becomes isolation, longevity becomes disconnection. In gravity's hands, the choice between enduring and belonging. Beyond the event horizon's immediate drama, the cosmos offers an array of temporal habitats. Planets, moons, and stellar environments each set their own metronome. The next section of this exploration reframes the problem at scale, not merely how gravity bends time at a singular boundary, but how different worlds sustain different tempos of existence. The question is simple in form, but profound in consequence. If time can be stretched and pooled by geometry, how diverse might planetary clocks be across the galaxy? Different planets, different rhythms. That sentiment might be obvious in outline, but staggering in implication. Planetary time is not a single variable, it is an ensemble of cycles: rotation, revolution, axial precession, atmospheric circulation, geologic uplift, and tidal lockings. Each contributes a beat to the local symphony of duration. A world that rotates every 10 hours writes a different bodily and cultural tempo than one that turns once every 300 days. A tidally locked planet with one face baking in perpetual day and the other cast in permanent night produces circadian patterns and social architectures unlike Earth's. The living processes that arise on such surfaces will be attuned to these cycles. Time, in that sense, is ecological. It is embedded in the rhythm. The variance is not only about daily life. Geological and climatic rhythms differ by orders of magnitude. A world with vigorous plate tectonics and a molten mantle will witness landscapes reconfigured on timescales that erase human-scale monuments within a few million years. A planet with a geologically quiet interior preserves surface features for orders of magnitude longer. Atmospheric chemistry and stellar spectral type govern biological turnover. Around a smaller, dimmer star, habitable zones sit closer in. Stellar flares may reset evolutionary experiments frequently, favoring life that can persist through bursts rather than unbroken centuries. These environmental tempos shape not just the physiology of organisms, but the social projects they undertake. Human thinking habitually projects its own temporal scale outward. Political terms, career arcs, and lifespans inform models of progress. But in a cosmically diverse set of worlds, such temporal parochialism is likely to misread the rhythms of others. Suppose a civilization arises on a planet where seasons last decades or where a day spans a year. Their cultural horizon, what is possible within a life, what can be presumed stable across generations, will differ dramatically from Earth's. They might conceive of legacy, obligation, or stewardship on slower or faster foundations. Communication between such civilizations would face not only linguistic and technological barriers, but temporal. The idea gives rise to a new anthropology of tempo. Civilizations can be fast or slow in many senses: biological generation time, institutional turnover, cultural memory. Fast tempos allow rapid innovation and adaptation, but render collective projects fragile. Slow tempos promote stability and long-term thinking, but can be rigid in the face of sudden shocks. The interaction between tempos is politically and morally charged. When two populations with divergent clocks encounter each other, the asymmetry in patience and perspective can become a source of miscommunication, exploitation, or neglect. The cosmic stage thus becomes populated with actors who do not merely disagree about interest. There are pragmatic reflections as well. Consider the problem of transmitting knowledge across deep time. On Earth, humans have attempted to design durable messages, monuments, libraries, seed vaults to survive centuries or millennia. For an interplanetary archive, the design constraints multiply. A message sent to a world whose rotational and orbital cycles differ wildly must account for signal delay, for divergent calendars, and for receivers whose attention windows may be measured in different units. The technical problems are tractable in principle, but the philosophical ones are not. Whom does the messenger serve when their definition of future is so alien to the recipient's experience? The comparison with gravitational slow pockets is revealing. A black hole's horizon offers a way to compress the external future into a manageable present for a local system, if one could survive the approach. Planetary diversity, by contrast, disperses temporalities across space without such radical distortion. The two are complementary possibilities for temporal diversity. One manipulates the metric of time itself, the other arranges agents along different natural cycles. Both force a reevaluation of stewardship and memory. Both compel a civilization to ask whether endurance should be achieved by synchronization, bringing disparate rhythms into agreement, or by accommodation, designing for plural tempos and accepting asynchronous outcomes. There is a moral core to these questions. The coherence of a civilization's self-conception depends on some shared calendar, an agreed-upon horizon that sets the terms of responsibility and the narrative of continuity. When tempos diverge across gravity wells, across planetary cycles, across biological generations, the threads that stitch a society into a coherent story loosen. The resulting tension is not merely academic. It shaped priorities, whether to invest in monuments, in slow-decaying archives, in rapid response technologies, or in practices of interpersonal immediacy. It shapes empathy, the ability to value futures that will be lived out on different clocks. Finally, thinking in tempos reframes humility. Earth's geological and biological history is already an admonition against arrogance. The amplification of temporal variety across planets and near horizons multiplies that admonition. The cosmos, as it turns out, is not indifferent only in the broad sense of being vast and ancient. It is indifferent in a more particular way. It holds many different meanings of time, and none is privileged. To be a species with a sense of continuity in such a cosmos is to choose, again and again, which currents to follow and which to respect from the bank. In the end, the event horizon and the variety of planetary clocks are two faces of the same lesson. Time is not a single, universal river, but an archipelago of currents. Some pools are slow and private. Some rapids rush with a speed that makes long-term projects nearly impossible. The ethical, aesthetic, and scientific task is to learn to navigate among them, to preserve what can be preserved, to witness what can be witnessed, and to accept the irreducible fact that belonging and endurance are not synonymous. The universe, with its horizons and its diverse planets, offers both shelter and distance. Knowing that a minute here may be a century, there is not merely a technical observation. It is a mode of humility, a way of learning to plan. What if every world kept its own ledger? What if the simple urge to ask, "What time is it?" dissolved as one crossed a planetary horizon, and with it, the assumption that clocks anywhere in the cosmos must somehow agree? That sharp idea, that time is not an indifferent backdrop, but a quality stamped by place, is the axis of this next thought. Not only great gravity wells, but ordinary planets set their own tempos. Different gravities, different orbits, different rotational speeds, each celestial body is a metronome with a distinct beat. The result is a universe where the passage of moments is manifold, where the rhythm of life, memory, and planning is stitched to local geometry. The physics of the claim is deceptively simple and quietly exacting. General relativity prescribes that time flows at rates that depend on gravitational potential. Clocks deeper in a gravity well tick more slowly, by a factor proportional to the potential difference divided by c squared. For Earth, that factor is tiny but measurable. For larger planets, the number grows. The upshot is not a wholesale rewiring of lived experience. A person on Mars will not feel centuries slip by overnight, but it is a real cumulative asymmetry. On Earth's surface, the gravitational potential makes a clock run long enough slower that, compared to a clock at infinity, it loses on the order of a few hundredths of a second a year. On Mars, the effect is weaker. On gas giants, richer and more marked. For a civilization that trusts the time, yet to stop at the arithmetic is to miss the richer landscape. A planet's tempo is not a single number but an ensemble of cycles. Rotation sets the day, revolution the year, axial tilt sculpts seasons, magnetic reversals and plate tectonics sketch epochs. A day on Saturn, a little over 10 hours, is a radically different scheduling constraint than a day on Mars, which drifts slightly longer than an Earth day. Venus turns so slowly that a single rotation takes longer than its year. Mercury keeps one face mostly sunlit as it is locked in a slow, resonant turn. Around many red dwarfs, habitable zones lie close enough that tidal locking becomes common, one hemisphere baked, the other frozen, the twilight ring the only place where a conventional day might. The biological echoes are speculative but compelling. On Earth, the roughly 24-hour cycle has shaped sleep, hormone cycles, attention spans, and the timing of cellular repair. On a world whose rotation is rapid, life might evolve nervous systems and behavioral patterns attuned to short bursts and frequent interruptions. On slow-rotating worlds, processes that on Earth would be the province of generations might become the pace of single lifetimes. Gravity itself wields subtle influence. It constrains body plans, affects the energy costs of movement, and thereby sculpts metabolic rates. Higher surface gravity makes extended locomotion costlier. It may favor compact morphologies and life histories that emphasize efficiency over speed. Conversely, low gravity offers economies of movement that might permit low. There is a practical precedent for thinking in planetary time already within human experience. When robotic missions first touched Mars, scientists on Earth adjusted their schedules to match Martian sols. Teams of engineers and scientists lived, briefly and intensely, on Mars time, meetings, sleep, eating all folded to a day that is 40 minutes longer than Earth's. The procedure was not an experiment in romance, but a pragmatic accommodation to signal delay and operational needs. Yet it produced bewilderment and fatigue in the human participants, a small-scale demonstration that changing the beat of daily life matters. Extend that thought across planetary systems and timescales, and the challenge matures: how to coordinate societies whose natural. The problem escalates from human scheduling to the architecture of institutions. Calendars are social contracts, shared ways of anchoring memory and expectation. They allow contracts to be enforced, promises to be kept, debts to be repaid across decades. A calendar tacitly institutes a consensus on simultaneity, a shared present. When two populations inhabit different gravitational potentials, when their days and years do not map one-to-one, then the fragile web of synchronized action phrase. Consider an exchange of knowledge between a civilization whose seasonal cycle spans centuries and one whose years are measured in days. Commitments and plans carry radically different temporal weights. Investment horizons, legal frameworks, moral obligations all assume some mutual endurance. Across diverse planetary, the pure physics also provides subtler elements. Rotating masses do more than deepen potential wells, they drag spacetime itself, an effect measured around Earth by careful gyroscope experiments. Around rapidly spinning giants, this frame dragging is larger, producing tiny twists in how inertial frames align. The effect is minute for daily life, but it is another way in which rotation introduces temporal texture. Photons, too, climbing out of deep potentials, redshift in ways that encode where and when they came from. Information becomes a fingerprint of place as much as time. One can imagine practical consequences for timekeeping and navigation. For satellites around Earth, relativistic corrections are everyday engineering. For an interplanetary civilization, the ledger keeping becomes more complex. Trading timestamps across planets requires an agreed protocol for transforming between local, proper times and a chosen coordinate time. Who writes the standard? Who ensures it applies across the variable curvatures and rotations of many worlds? These are not abstract conundrums. They are governance problems with technological, legal, and moral facets. Coordination across diverse clocks demands institutions designed for asynchrony, protocols that accept and work with time. Relativistic corrections, with commitments that span mismatched durations, with archives that can be. Archivally, the multiplicity of planetary times suggests alternative strategies for preservation. On Earth, humans build seed vaults and nuclear repositories with horizons of tens of thousands of years. Near a massive planet, gravitational time dilation could, in principle, be used to slow subjective decay, not in the sense of avoiding entropy, but in the sense of prolonging a local present relative to outside worlds. The idea is alluring but treacherous. The gains in preservation time are modest on planetary scales compared with those near black holes. They accumulate slowly. They also come at practical and ethical costs. Placing archives where local time is extended may render those archives out of phase with the societies that need them. The cultural consequences are rich fodder for speculation. Rituals tether communities to their calendars. Festivals celebrate harvests and celestial alignments. Mourning practices map onto calendars of life and death. For a civilization on a world with long, drawn-out seasons, patience and long-term thinking may become virtues embedded in rites and institutions. For a civilization on a frenetic world, improvisation and rapid innovation could be prized. When such cultures encounter each other, through migration, trade, or the remnant traces of a shared origin, the friction will be not merely technological but ontological. They will disagree on what soon means, on what future generations encompass, on the timescale appropriate for political promises. One can envision moral dilemmas that would confound current intuitions. If one group seeks to encode its history into a monument meant to survive millennia on its native planet, but another group needs those same materials to avert an imminent catastrophe measured in fast cycles, how are priorities decided? The question reframes familiar debates about intertemporal justice into a plural tempo context. The justice of actions must now be evaluated across clocks that do not align, and fairness becomes a question of temporal translation as much as equitable resource allocation. The difference between planetary tempos and the extreme case of black holes is instructive. Near an event horizon, time can be stretched into a gulf. Minutes there become millennia outside. That is a radical form of asynchrony, almost categorical in its alienation. Planetary differences are subtler and, in some respects, more insidious because they are ordinary. They accumulate day by day, year by year. They do not demand singular engineering feats to produce, they are baked into the architecture of habit. They make plural time a lived condition rather than a speculative thought experiment. To live across planets is to master a new anthropology of duration, to design social forms that are resilient to There is a final aesthetic and ethical lesson here, echoing the melancholy of the horizons discussed earlier. To recognize that a minute here may be a different kind of minute, there is to accept a certain localness of meaning. Human life, with all its projects and attachments, is anchored to particular rhythms, to the cycles of a particular sky, the weight of a particular gravity. That anchoredness is not a failing, it is the condition of being embodied and finite. Yet where possible, wisdom, whether scientific, political, or moral, will cultivate the capacity to translate across tempos. It will build institutions for intertemporal dialogue, it will design archives for asynchronous readers, and it will choose policies that do not assume. In the end, the cosmos offers not one river of time but a braided estuary. Planets are pools and rapids, each with a distinct cadence shaped by mass, motion, and geometry. Superimposed on those planetary pulses are the more dramatic beats of horizons and singularities, where time undergoes its most violent contortions. For any mind that seeks continuity, for any civilization that wishes to keep a story across many seasons, the task is to learn to live with plural clocks. That is a technical problem, a political challenge, and a moral demand. It is also, if one listens closely, an invitation to greater humility, the recognition that endurance is local, that memory requires translation, and that to belong to the universe is often to accept. What does it mean to meet a familiar face and find that the calendar has betrayed recognition? What does it feel like to step back into a social world that has marched forward while the body that left barely saw a season change? The twin paradox is not an abstract classroom puzzle. When gravity is brought into the thought experiment, the paradox acquires an almost cruel intimacy. It becomes a question about memory, belonging, responsibility, and about how deeply physics can intrude upon the everyday fabric of a life. In its simplest formulation, the twin paradox begins as an image. Two beings who share an origin and a birth moment, but who follow different paths through space-time. One remains bound to the slow, familiar river of a planet, while the other takes a route that sketches a profound detour, accelerating to high speeds or lingering near a massive gravity well. When the traveler returns, the ledger is settled, the clocks do not agree. The one who journeyed may have aged months, the one who stayed behind years or decades. The paradox, in this sense, is not in any logical inconsistency, but in the rupture of shared chronology. Physics provides the arithmetic, human life supplies the stakes. The classical twin paradox is often framed within special relativity. High-speed travel creates differences in elapsed proper time because moving clocks run slow. But when the twin's route involves a black hole, gravity, rather than pure velocity, becomes the agent of temporal distortion. General relativity replaces uniform frames with curved spacetime, and the presence of a deep gravitational potential near an event horizon stretches the relation between the traveler's proper time and the external coordinate time to a degree that is countersensical on human scales. In other words, to hover near the lip of a supermassive black hole is to subject one's seconds to a different economy. Imagine this as a designed experiment in emotional terms, rather than as a blueprint for spacefaring logistics. A pair who start together are separated by a deliberate choice. One remains on Earth, continuing work, family rights, the slow accretion of gray hair and institutional obligations. The other takes a mission toward the center of a galaxy, approaching a supermassive black hole carefully, maintaining a precarious station where the curvature of spacetime is significant yet not necessarily fatal. Instruments measure the discrepancy in ticks as if deploying a ruler against time. Telemetry records the redshift of signals climbing out of the gravity well. Mission control back home watches frequencies stretch, notes slow pulses. The mathematics yields a stark prediction. That arithmetic has visceral consequences when translated into human terms. The returning traveler steps off a vessel into a world whose streets, buildings, and registries have been altered by the years that were denied to the traveler's proper time. Photographs from the home, once familiar, now show children grown into parents. Institutions have changed leadership. Local languages have shifted idioms. friends have died. The traveler's subjective memory is a compacted narrative, compressed seasons, repeated routines, whereas the stay behind's life reads as a chronicle of continuity, funerals and marriages, and small, cumulative betrayals of the planet's surface by weather and governance. The meeting between the two is an encounter across two different temporal grammars. The emotional topography of such reunions can be imagined by tracing the small gestures people use to certify each other's continuity. Hands reach out, fingers brush a cheek, a greeting is offered and reinterpreted as ritual or test. The person who stayed may read the traveler as a younger version of the self they once knew, an echo of a past person, while the returnee sees an aged figure who carries decades of experience the traveler did not share. There is relief and loss braided together. Relief that any connection remains at all. Loss in realizing how much continuity was forfeited. The reunion becomes a microcosm of grief. Grief for the time that cannot be revisited, for the rituals missed, for the children that have become elders in a few. These are not merely poetic extrapolations. The cognitive dissonance produced by disproportionate aging is likely to be profound. Memory is relational. Personal identity is stitched through narratives told to and about us, shared jokes, repetitive acts, mutual witnesses to events. When the fabric of witness is pulled taut by differential durations, the seams show. The traveler's memories of domesticity are faded prints. The social world's memory of the traveler is a film that continued in their absence. This mismatch complicates relationships. The traveler may feel survivor's guilt, a sense that personal curiosity came at the cost of belonging. The stay behind may feel abandoned or betrayed, even if the departure was mutual and consented. There can be beyond the immediate psychological terrain, the twin scenario forces a civilization to confront practical and legal dilemmas. What is a birth date worth when clocks disagree? How does inheritance law adapt when one claimant has aged decades more than their biological sibling? How do pensions, citizenship, and social status travel across mismatched timelines? Institutions are predicated on a shared calendar. They assume continuity of witness and enforceability of promises. When one individual remains embedded in a slow pocket of proper time, the social contracts around them fray. Courts, recommended social services, family structures, these systems must be reimagined to accommodate the fact that clocks can pull apart, and there is also an ethical axis to the decision to undertake such a voyage. The choice to compress personal subjective time relative to a common public timeline carries consequences that ripple outward. Volunteers may opt to become temporal observers, witnesses to the distant future driven by scientific curiosity or the desire to preserve memory. But those decisions do not occur in a vacuum. Families are affected, communities recalibrate their expectations. The social cost is not equally distributed. Those with access to advanced technologies, capable of putting instruments or minds near a horizon, could, in principle, choose to remove themselves from shared historical timelines. The disparity introduces a justice problem. Who has the right to exit a common calendar, and what of? Technically, the twin paradox with a black hole involves more than passive proximity. The traveler's world line, the space-time path taken, defines their elapsed proper time. To linger in a slow time pocket, the mission must negotiate tidal gradients and radiation environments. Only extremely massive black holes offer the gentler tidal forces that make proximity survivable at macroscopic scales. But even those settings are not free of hazard. The costs of station keeping, the energy to fight orbital decay, and the exposure to high-energy flux all impose constraints. In practice, any such mission would be an engineering and biological enterprise as much as a philosophical one. Its planners would weigh the benefits of temporal magnification against the. When scientists and storytellers extrapolate from the twin paradox, they also confront a cultural dimension. How would myths and narratives adapt to the reality that time can be contracted and stretched? There is a deep resonance with ancient tales of travelers who return to find that the world has moved on, folk motifs in which nights become centuries, or where those who cross sacred thresholds experience temporal exile. The physics gives these motifs literal teeth. That persistent coincidence between human imagination and mathematical allowance suggests why the twin paradox feels like a parable. It distills a universal sorrow, an anxiety about separations, about becoming out of step with one's kin. It asks whether continuity is something. The twin paradox also recalibrates how societies think about preservation. The idea of using gravity-induced time dilation as a means of sheltering information, cultural artifacts, or biological samples invites both fascination and caution. On the one hand, a repository placed in a slow pocket effectively buys subjective time. It delays the audience for those records, stretching their local presence so that the world beyond ages more quickly relative to them. On the other hand, the price is temporal exile. An archive that is preserved for millennia in a near-horizon station may be useless to contemporaries who must live in the accelerating present. Preservation becomes an act that might surrender relevance for longevity. The act raises questions about stewardship. To whom is preservation directed? Posterity or some abstract? There are also subtle cognitive effects to consider. Human beings are tempo creatures, circadian rhythms, attention spans, and social institutions are tuned to particular temporal scales. A traveler who returns younger than their peers might also find that their perception of time is different. Their subjective psychological tempo, how quickly emotions rise and fall, how patience is distributed, could be out of step with social rhythms. This is not merely an awkward social adjustment, it is a phenomenological shift. The experience of waiting becomes transformed when one has lived through a period where the external world evolves dramatically while the inner life did not. Conversely, the person who stayed may look upon the traveler as someone whose inner life is compressed into a narrow temporal corridor, whose continuity with previous habits. The twin paradox scenario thus becomes a prism through which a civilization can examine its own relationship to time. It makes evident the assumptions baked into governance, into family life, into ethics. It highlights a simple but profound fact: time is not neutral. It is a resource and a frame, and differences in its distribution generate social tensions no less real than disparities of wealth or power. Some may frame the possibility of traveling into slow time pockets as a form of temporal privilege, a chance to preserve, to witness, to escape the immediate tide of events. Others will see it as an evasion, a refusal to participate in the responsibilities of a shared future. The narrative arc of the twin paradox also serves as an object lesson about scientific humility. The arithmetic of relativity is precise and unmoved by sentiment. It makes promises about clock rates and proper time that are testable in principle. But the human consequences, the grief, the bureaucratic conundrums, the moral dilemmas are messy and not reducible to equations. The paradox, therefore, invites an interdisciplinary conversation. Engineers and physicists can map the world lines and mission profiles. Philosophers and social scientists must articulate the norms that govern such voyages. Communities and legal systems must decide how to integrate the consequences into their codes. There is finally a gentle ethical knot at the center of the thought experiment. If faced with the opportunity to step into a slow time pocket, what reasons would justify doing so? Scientific curiosity alone will not silence the queries of kin. The act of time shifting is an act with ripple effects across relationships and institutions. It may advance knowledge or preserve a fragment of culture. It may also inflict loneliness or deepen inequality. The twin paradox thus becomes an ethical test: how to weigh individual desire to see farther against communal needs for shared presence. It asks whether endurance is an individual achievement, an archival victory, or a collective project that requires. When the traveler and the stay-behind finally meet, their reunion is a compressed epic. It is a point where the equations of physics and the narratives of human life collide. The paradox does not offer tidy resolutions. Rather, it functions as a mirror. It reflects back the values of the society that contemplates these possibilities. A civilization that prizes continuity above all will treat time shifting with suspicion. One that values the preservation of knowledge as an obligation to an unknown future may embrace the technique with solemn ritual. Both responses are intelligible, both are partial. In the end, the twin paradox is less a puzzle to be solved than a question to be asked again and again. What does it mean to live with others in time? The physics shows that the sameness of the present is an illusion. The human response must decide how to live with that plurality. If minutes can be sculpted into decades and back again by the geometry of the cosmos, then the moral task is to fashion institutions and norms that can translate across tempos, to keep promises, to preserve meaning, and to find ways of belonging that are resilient to differential aging. That task is as technical as it is tender. It requires the sober arithmetic of relativistic clocks and the quiet courage of communities willing to accept, always, that some meetings across time will be impossible. What would it mean to be born on a world whose calendar was stitched to a gravitational seam, that a single orbit, a single harvest cycle, would mark not a handful of human lifetimes elsewhere, but the slow sweep of entire ages? The thought unhooks the imagination from ordinary time and forces it to consider a life lived in a different currency, years minted by deep gravity, valued against centuries in the wider galaxy. Such worlds are not mere figments of science fiction. They are a logical consequence of general relativity married to astrophysical possibility. Around a supermassive black hole, at a distance where tides are gentle enough and orbital velocities stable, a planet can sleep in a pocket of dilated time. For those who inhabit it, the sky and the daily round could feel familiar. The physics is precise in its bluntness. Near an extreme gravitational well, proper time, the time felt by clocks on the planet runs more slowly relative to coordinate time defined by distant observers. The factor can be dramatic. A year on such a planet might correspond to hundreds of years measured elsewhere. But the arithmetic does not capture the texture of living there. To think about life near the abyss is to think about rhythm, narrative, social contract, and the politics of being out of step with the larger cosmos. It is to ask how a civilization organizes its obligations when its internal seconds by what? To the universe are centuries. What kind of moral imagination grows where memory and expectation are stretched by gravity itself? The sky above such a world would be uncanny. Gravitational lensing would paint the firmament with double the smeared constellations. Far stars might arc and split into rings and ghosts, as light jostled and bent on its long journey from distant sources. If the black hole hosts an accretion disk, an enormous luminous ring of matter spiraling inwards, then the night could glow with a permanent, slow-burning aurora, a ring of incandescent debris that tilts and shifts across centuries outside, while the planet's eye registers it as a gradual, almost statuesque change. If the system lacks a bright companion star, life would have adapted to dim, redder illumination, or to geothermal warmth, or to light harvested from high-energy processes. The very colors of the first and most ordinary consequence is communal tempo. On a planet where subjectively short durations correspond to astronomical intervals elsewhere, institutions would necessarily be designed for patience. Political regimes would have to reckon with the fact that a single administrative term, as measured locally, might bracket social and technological revolutions across the galaxy. Legal frameworks, inheritance practices, education, and religious observance would orient toward endurance. Where earthly calendars tethered promises to decades, here promises might be drafted for centuries beyond the horizon of most other civilizations. Long-term planning would become not a rhetorical flourish, but the core competence of governance. This reorientation towards slow durability would reshape aesthetics and material culture. Architecture would be conservative by design, but not merely conservative in style. It would encode redundancy, modularity, and materials chosen for resistances that matter in the external frame. A monument meant to be legible to future visitors from outside would confront a paradox. Its local present would seem to pass ordinarily to distant civilizations. The monument's construction and decay would be stretched across epochs. Those who build for posterity might adopt forms that readable across radically different perceptual timescales, markers that endure chemically and symbolically even as languages shift. Stone inscriptions and radiogenic markers would be partnered with formats intelligible to hypothetical far-future decoders. Birth and death acquire a new social grammar. When an infant's year corresponds to a century beyond, the social meaning of generations is transformed. Lineage in the local register may be measured in lives that, to outside observers, overlap in strange ways. A grandparent in external time may seem to belong to a civilization already fallen, while a single family could project into the future and yet remain effectively contemporaneous by their own clock. Commemoration practices would adapt. Memorials might be designed to carry cues readable by both slow-time inhabitants and those who arrive from fast-time frames, an attempt to bridge the yawning gap between lived memory and distant history. Rituals for mourning and continuity would likely center patience as a moral virtue. Economics, too, bends under the weight of dilation. Exchanges with outside markets become fraught exercises. Trade done across a relativistic divide risks being asymmetric. Goods that arrive from the outside may be obsolete by external standards before they finish their local transport routes. Conversely, exports sent to outside partners will carry messages stamped with centuries of delay. Investment horizons in such a society would be oddly out of phase with typical capitalist time preferences. Short-term profit strategies common elsewhere would seem ephemeral. Long-range stewardship projects, hydrological control, biosphere management, curated archives would look rational. Currency systems might incorporate temporal indexing, acknowledging the differential value of contracts when one communication presents another knotty problem. Radio pulses climbing out of the gravity well would redshift and slow. Signals arriving from distant partners would seem accelerated. A message dispatched as a plea for help could arrive at the recipient's end long after the sender's situation has evolved into a new state incomprehensible to the receiver. Conversely, news from the outside would pour past the planet as if through the mesh of a sieve. Centuries of change could be compressed into the local sense of a protracted epistle. Cultural transmission with the rest of the galaxy would therefore be episodic and discontinuous. Diplomatic relationships would be built on protocols that accept asynchrony, agreements that carry clauses for acceptance of outcomes across mismatched clocks, instructions for cut. Emotional life would be uniquely inflected as well. The psychology of hope and the ethics of obligation would mutate where the future is both near and impossibly far. Parents, teachers, and leaders would teach patience not as a stoic virtue, but as a practical skill. The children of the slow-time world would grow up acutely aware that their immediate desires could have consequences stretching into ages elsewhere, and that decisions often amount to fiduciary acts toward beings who, by the time consequences manifest across external frames, no longer share the same life world. This could cultivate a form of intergenerational empathy hardened into habit, an ethical realism that makes stewardship non-negotiable. But there is a darker side as well. Alienation might take root, for inhabitants could feel themselves Biological implications would depend on the planet's specifics. If the surface gravity and local stars' radiation permit life, evolutionary pathways could select for rhythms attuned to long, stable cycles. Circadian systems might lengthen. Reproductive strategies could favor slower maturation and extended parental investment. Cognitive life, if it arises, could develop a preference for extended attention spans and long-term planning woven into neurobiology. Conversely, if the environment is dim and driven by irregular high-energy events, life might favor dormancy, episodic awakening, and slow metabolic rates, strategies that make living through the external acceleration practical. The biology of patience becomes an adaptation, not only. There are also uncomfortable moral questions. If a civilization chooses to settle such a world deliberately, intending thus to insulate some knowledge or population from the ravages of the external timeline, then who makes that decision? And what promises must be made to those who remain outside? The temptation to use a slow-time world as an archive or vault is palpable. Terminals of rare knowledge, seeds of species, syntactic keys to languages. Yet the act of sequestering knowledge in a temporal pocket is ethically ambiguous. Preservation implies a deferred readership that may never arrive. Cultural choices encoded in such a vault might outlast the context that gave them meaning, producing artifacts that are archaeologically interesting but socially inert. There is a At the level of cosmological meaning, living near the abyss reframes the human or post-human impulse toward immortality and legacy. On such a world, the possibility of witnessing distant futures is real in a qualified sense. Residents might see, in their telescopes and instruments, rapid sequences of external centuries, as if watching an accelerated film. This voyeur's view of futurity tempts a certain hubris, the belief that one can watch the arc of other civilizations, their rise and fall, as if from the shore of a slow river. But the more sobering perspective recognizes that watching is not the same as participating. Observing the grandeur of a galaxy's cultural shifts is a different kind of knowledge than being able to shape them. That distinction, technological life support near a black hole, would demand extraordinary engineering, station keeping against residual frame dragging, shielding from high-energy particles, and management of angular momentum in an environment where space-time itself is being deformed would all be routine concerns. These are not insurmountable problems in principle for a sufficiently advanced society, but they would orient the society's competencies toward maintenance and resilience. The technology of endurance, redundant systems, decentralized repair cultures, broad apprenticeship networks becomes culturally central. The social prestige attached to the craft of repair and the moral esteem for people who can sustain infrastructures across subjective centuries would be profound. There is also an inevitability to cosmic solitude. To a distant astronomer, the slow-time planet is a tantalizing anomaly, an island of long duration in a sea of fast cultural tides. Missions from outside would be rare and asynchronous, their arrivals telescoped into the planet's subjective decades as extended visits or as flurries of strange, fast-aged emissaries. Exchanges would be precious and odd. The slow-time inhabitants might treat visitors as emissaries from an altered epoch, interpreters of a future that their own institutions had not yet needed to internalize. The social rituals around such visits would be laden, ceremonies to honor the mismatch, complex protocols to translate time-bound norms. At an ethical and existential register, the slow-time world presses a perennial question: what does it mean to be remembered? The black hole's patience can hold memory in a local present, while the broader cosmos rewrites itself in rapid sequence. That capacity to preserve can be read as hope, the belief that some things can be kept safe from immediate entropy. It can also be read as a form of exile, a choice to decouple one's narrative from the living, messy business of synchrony. In that tension lies the heart of the moral imagination generated by such worlds. Endurance becomes a philosophical stance, a life lived for the sake of distant readers, or a life lived in fidelity to immediate communities. The choice is not only strategic, but ontological. In the end, a world near the abyss is a study in scale. It teaches humility about the localness of meaning and the arbitrariness of the now. For those who would live there, the quotidian would be extraordinary in its ordinariness: long evenings, gradual shifts in weather and light, institutions folded around patient time. For those looking in from outside, the planet is a slow-motion memorial that compresses centuries into the sweep of a few local seasons. The contrast between these perspectives is not merely observational, it is moral. It asks every intelligence that contemplates it whether endurance is best expressed by pulling close to an ordered present or by remaining tethered to a common clock that binds communities across space. What if the safest place to hide a life from time's erosion were not underground or sealed in a vault, but to sit deliberately where time itself runs thin? To choose, by position and physics, a slower heartbeat of the cosmos. That is the proposition at the heart of this section, an advanced civilization that treats gravity not merely as an obstacle to overcome, but as an instrument to be played, a metronome to be tuned. Instead of fleeing the universe's long future, it steps closer to a particular seam in spacetime and lets the geometry of the cosmos become its shield. The idea is deceptively simple in theory and fiendishly complex in practice. Near a supermassive black hole, proper time, the time felt by an organism or a clock, can be made to run far more slowly relative to a distant observer. The equation is unsentimental. Deeper gravitational potential equals slower local seconds. An orbit placed carefully at a radius where tidal gradients remain survivable, or a station-keeping platform that hovers at the edge of a deep well, buys the inhabitants a prolonged subjective present while epochs elide outside. Centuries, millennia, even geological ages outside can be compressed into lifetimes for those who arrange to live there. So the civilization that chooses this path treats the black hole as a temporal The real work of such a choice unfolds in technical detail. The first challenge is location. Small, stellar mass black holes are lethal from a tidal standpoint. Their horizons are sharp knives. Only supermassive black holes, millions to billions of solar masses, present the gentle curvature gradients necessary for macroscopic habitation near their innermost stable orbits. The civilization must map an orbital niche carefully, far enough that tidal shear, spaghettification, and high-energy flux from an accretion disk do not shred matter, yet close enough that the gravitational potential meaningfully dilates proper time. This is not an architectural flourish but a life-or-death calculation for engineering such niches transforms astrophysics into civil infrastructure. Habitats become orbital towns that must manage radiation shielding against both cosmic rays and the potent fluxes that can emanate from nearby plasma. Power plants harvest the black hole's rotational energy, magnetic fields coupled with ionized flows, engineered Penrose-like processes, or carefully regulated accretion funnels that provide a steady source of energy without spiking into destructive flares. Station keeping demands efficient momentum management in a frame dragged by a rapidly spinning mass. Technology must counteract lens, steering precession, and preserve orbital planes. Repair cultures, humans or machines, specialize in maintenance regimes. These technical designs shape social forms. Institutions are remade for patience. A political term on such a world is not a slogan for a few months of campaigning, but a covenant spanning subjective decades, whose external durations amount to centuries. Law becomes conservatism in time. Charters are written with clauses that assume the possibility that external alliances will not be ratified until the signatories, by their own clocks, are long gone. Education systems nest apprenticeships across what would be, to an outside observer, eras. Knowledge transmission is centered on methods of durable repair and interpretation rather than quick innovation. The civilization's economy rebalances, speculative short-term gain becomes morally suspect, stewardship and the psychological landscape is equally altered. The community must cultivate a temporal sensibility distinct from the more immediate tempos of planets nearer to the galactic periphery. Patience is not a quaint virtue, but an existential competency. Individuals learn to internalize a long-horizon perspective, to weigh consequences not only for descendants by blood, but for future custodians who will inherit the responsibility to maintain our ecologies and seed repositories across external millennia. Ritual life mirrors this orientation. Commemoration rituals become rehearsals in sustained memory. Chronicles elaborately cross-index events against both local proper time and external coordinate anniversaries so that stories can be recognized by possible future visitors from outside frames. Ceremonies. There are also science-driven motives that make the choice tempting. For a species that fears cosmic-scale threats, nearby supernova, gamma-ray bursts, stellar migration, orbital destabilization, the slow pocket offers a form of hedge. A biosphere, a genetic archive, or a repository of cultural knowledge preserved in a region of dilated time is effectively insulated against disasters that would, in the external coordinate, obliterate entire civilizational networks in a few thousand years. By living in such a pocket, the civilization frames itself as a living arc, not frozen corpses, but continuing, evolving communities that experience continuity locally, while the wider galaxy cycles through ages. But time as a shield has moral contours that are less clean. The decision to shelter life in such a way raises questions about access, consent, and intergenerational obligation. Who is chosen to live in the slow pocket? If access is limited by technology, energy, or the availability of suitable habitats, then preservation becomes a privilege. The civilization must confront whether it will use the temporal refuge to protect a narrow elite, to preserve biodiversity indiscriminately, or to serve as a deliberately curated archive for future readers. The act of deciding whom to preserve is itself a moral act with long tails. Those saved will experience subjective continuity, while those left outside age and perish in the fast river. Their history. This tension calls forth institutional answers. Some societies, imagining themselves custodians of all life, set up lotteries, randomized selection processes to distribute entrants into slow-time habitats. Others prioritize keystone species, genetic lineages, or cultural artifacts deemed vital to a broader project's future. Still others adopt a model of reciprocity, rotating habitation with timed swaps so that more individuals can experience the slow cohort for parts of their lives, trading off continuity in exchange for participation in planetary life outside. Each model carries trade-offs: fairness versus efficacy, inclusivity versus survivability. The ethical calculus is inevitably contested, and debates about generational equity become. Isolation is another, more subtle cost. Even if a community organizes justly, living in a slow pocket detaches people from the shared calendars that create social belonging on larger scales. News from outside, incoming messages, diplomatic envoys, cultural artifacts, arrives accelerated relative to the pocket's own subjective rhythms, a film strip of centuries played at a crawl. Conversely, outbound transmissions appear abrupt to recipients whizzing forward on faster clocks. Communication protocols must therefore be sophisticated not only in error correction but in cultural translation, timestamps that embed both a local temporal frame and a converted coordinate time, metadata that signals the expected delay and the normative weight of messages. Psychologically, the effect on identity is complex. Residents of slow pockets often describe a dual temporality, an intimate sense of continuity in private life layered atop a public sense of watching a film of the universe's future. This vantage produces peculiar dispositions. On one hand, the longer subjective continuity can produce deep stewardship, a tendency to care for long-horizon projects, and a capacity for patience that is rare elsewhere. On the other hand, prolonged observation of a galaxy moving through rapid cycles can create a distanced, almost anthropological relation to other SIBs, the temptation to watch rather than to act, to become a spectator to external dramas rather than a participant. The moral challenge. Natural science complicates the idol. The black hole's environment is not static. Accretion rates can change, jets can flare, surrounding stellar dynamics can destabilize orbits over external timescales. The eventual evaporation of a black hole via Hawking radiation is a timescale so vast, far beyond current comprehension for supermassive examples, that it may seem irrelevant. But the near-term astrophysical environment remains uncertain. A catastrophe outside the pocket, such as a migrating star cluster or a galactic merger, could alter tidal regimes and make previously safe orbits dangerous. Thus, the civilization must build not only for stasis but for adaptability, habitats that can migrate, systems that can realign to new stable. Biology is an arena of both promise and fragility. For life forms adapted to a slow planetary day and a temporally conservative culture, reproduction, development, and learning can be tuned to long spans. Cognitive architectures might favor depth of attention and long-term planning. At the same time, genetic diversity must be actively managed. A closed, slow community risks drift, inbreeding, and loss of resilience. Migration corridors, timed exchanges with outside worlds, become critical biological strategies, but they are politically fraught. To rotate populations for genetic health is also to expose residents to the rapid aging and social churn of the external world, undermining the very continuity. Cultural preservation takes forms both traditional and exotic. Stone and metal archives, designed to resist corrosion, are only the beginning. The civilization may invest in layered encoding strategies, robust radiochemical libraries, high-fidelity DNA seed banks, and distributed neural backups encoded with contextual metadata indicating the epochs and socio-ecological contexts of their origin. Some experiments go further. Conscious minds migrated into substrates calibrated to long subjective durations, neural patterns stored and periodically reanimated to preserve narrative continuity. Such practices raise questions about the meaning of personhood and continuity. Is a mind preserved and reanimated decades later the same person? The black hole's. There is a final, philosophical kernel under all these technological and social machinations. Time as a shield reframes what it means to be responsible to the future. In ordinary practice, preservation is an act performed against entropy and forgetfulness. Near a black hole, preservation can also be an act of temporal displacement, relocating stories and beings into a limited region where fewer external agents can cause sudden annihilation. That power confers responsibility. Choosing to preserve some things in the slow pocket is tantamount to choosing what futures to prioritize. The civilization becomes, by design, an arbiter of which narratives and which lives will survive external calamities. That arbiter role can. For a civilization that takes time as a shield, the choice is thus an ethical architecture as much as a technological program. Engineering solutions build habitats and harvest energy. Legal structures organize access and intertemporal obligations. Biological programs manage diversity. Cultural forms ritualize patience. Underneath, however, lies a recurring question. What is the point of prolonging life if the act of prolonging severs the social ties that give life meaning? The civilization must answer whether preservation is an end in itself or a means to sustain relationships across epochs. It must decide whether to be a vault for the dead and distant or a living society that remains connected, in meaningful, though asynchronous. In practice, many such civilizations would probably adopt mixtures, distributed strategies that combine slow pockets near black holes with redundancy spread across less extreme gravitational basins, periodically exchanged cohorts to maintain genetic and cultural vitality, diplomatic protocols that treat time as a shared resource to be negotiated rather than a possession to be hoarded. The black hole becomes one node in a lattice of temporal hedges, an archival cathedral for some things, a living habitat for others, and a laboratory for still more. The successful models are those that accept plural tempos rather than attempting to impose a universal cadence. The ultimate irony is philosophical and a little bittersweet. In bending their lives to the slow beat near an abyss, such civilizations learn an ancient lesson again that endurance is a form of choice as much as it is a gift of physics. Time can be shielded, deferred, and stretched, but what is shielded is not automatically saved from oblivion's social forms. Continuity demands care, technical, legal, and moral. The slow pocket removes some external threats but simultaneously asks its inhabitants to cultivate virtues they cannot import: humility before scales larger than policy cycles, empathy for memories that are not shared, and prudence in deciding which stories deserve to be writ in the patient ink of a universe that keeps slow books. In the end, treating time as a shield is both a survival tactic and a moral experiment. What did it cost, in the end, to buy a little more of time? That question sits at the heart of the slow clock wager. The physics makes the trade simple and dreadful in the same breath. Approach a deep gravitational well, and your seconds become scarce. Live there, and the outside universe races ahead. But the arithmetic, years exchanged for hours, centuries for minutes, obscures the true currency being spent. What is surrendered when a life, a city, or a library is placed where proper time crawls? The answer is not solely measured in numbers. It is measured in ties, in rituals, in the invisible social threads that bind persons and peoples into a continuous story. From the outside, the price appears as an almost clinical phenomenon: desynchronization. Signals climb out of the gravity well stretched and reddened. Timestamps recorded locally mean little to distant clocks. A message sent as an urgent plea arrives at the recipient's end centuries later in coordinate time. A reply dispatched by a fast-moving polity pounds against slow time ears as a torrent of developments that need contextual translation. Even the language for soon becomes unstable. But when that clinical fact is translated into human terms, the cost takes on shape and sound. Hands that reach for one another and find instead the ghost of a gesture, family photographs that show children grown into strangers. Imagine, not as a romance but as a civic eventuality, a community that elected preservation over participation. Its archives are immaculate, its seed banks, its encoded cultural anthologies, its libraries are curated with obsessive care. From the vantage of local clocks, these acts are celebrations of prudence. From the galaxy's rim, they look like secession, a withdrawal from the messy, shared present that culture normally requires. The slow clock society buys protection from entropy and, with it, distance from the very people from whom meaning flows. The price is social tangibility, the ability to be seen, to be mourned in real time, to appear in the webs of memory that make belonging possible. The sensory details of that rupture are small and intimate. A letter arrives centuries late, wrapped in metadata that marks it as an artifact rather than news. Names no longer register, dates are inscrutable, references refer to institutions that have dissolved. A wedding ring returns through a courier as an archaeological specimen. The person who kept faith with it has become an ancestor before the hand ever closed. Communities that were once embedded in interwoven relations, trade partners, joint scientific consortia, diasporas, find their contracts unmoored. Pensions and legal claims are written against calendars that no longer share a baseline. Property records fracture into ledger lines that mean different things depending on which clock one trusts. That social exile has cascading effects. Decision-making assumes different weights and horizons. Where a polity tied to a fast clock must negotiate in the currency of electoral cycles, market quarters, and the exigencies of immediate survival, the slow community can afford patience and planning measured in scales that make most politics seem short-sighted. That institutional advantage becomes a cultural habit. Risk aversion baked into governance, conservatism prized as a virtue, innovation sometimes demonized as gratuitous. The slower tempo yields impressive strengths, robust maintenance cultures, deep craft traditions, institutions optimized for reliability. But it also promotes a kind of cultural sclerosis. Worlds that keep their calendars to gravity are superb. There is also a justice problem. Time as a refuge is not neutral in who it shelters. building habitats in gentle regions of supermassive black holes, maintaining station-keeping platforms, engineering radiation shields. These are expensive undertakings. Those with resources, political power, or technological mastery become the likely beneficiaries. A slow-time sanctuary therefore refracts existing inequalities into the temporal domain. The wealthy or technologically dominant can choose a kind of temporal exile, while the less privileged remain in the faster, more perilous world. The political question is stark and raw: who gets to slow their clock and who cannot? If the aim of such interventions is the preservation of knowledge or life itself, even absent inequality, the act of withdrawing into a slow beat carries heavy moral consequences. The insular culture that results from social habits to curricula learns to value the future in an absolute way. That ethic can ennoble some choices: long-term ecological management, care for slow-living species, patient stewardship of technology. But it can also enable an ethic of detachment. Observation can become an excuse for inaction. Watching a civilization on the fast side of the divide implode as if through a telescope affords an intimate, almost irresistible temptation to record, to categorize, to store, but not to intervene. The slow observers may become the world's waiters, conservers of fragments, interpreters. The psychological toll on individuals is intimate and strangely particular. Memory is not purely a private phenomenon, it is social practice. Stories are kept alive by repetition, by shared witnesses, by rituals that anchor names into the present. When those witnesses are removed by temporal separation, memory calcifies. The person who remains in the slow pocket retains intimate recollections of a world that, in the metric that matters to others, has been replaced. That isolation shapes identity, a sense of being out of time that is not merely intellectual but corporeal. Rituals, meals, Jubilee festivals require other minds to recognize their significance. Without reciprocation, rites become exercises in private fidelity. The moral ecology of such a life hardens into two opposing. Returning introduces a different and bitter price. If an inhabitant of a slow pocket chooses, for whatever reason, to step back into the fast world, whether to visit, to trade, or to rejoin kin, the mismatch is not merely a matter of paperwork. One can compute the delta in years, one cannot compute the delta in expectations. The returning group finds landscapes altered, coastlines changed by sea level shifts, towns repurposed or buried, languages morphed into dialects that barely register. Social networks have rewired, obligations have been discharged or died. The returnee may be legally recognized, physically present, and yet effectively from another epoch. Empathy sometimes smooths such meetings, but the friction remains: grief for those lost, bewilderment, accustom. The technical side of that price is relentless. Maintaining communication across mismatched clocks demands more than polite headers. It requires protocol, metadata that embeds coordinate time references, redundancy against jitter and redshift, error-correcting codes that survive frequency stretching. Relay hubs must be positioned in multiple gravitational potentials to mediate messages between frames. Complex timestamping conventions must be invented and agreed upon. Those are solvable engineering problems in principle, but they are expensive and socially fraught. Who hosts the relay? Which coordinate time standard becomes normative? The establishment of any such standard entails soft power. Those who set the clock's conventions gain political leverage over how historical narratives are reconciled. There are also biological implications. Closed, slow communities risk genetic bottlenecks. If demographic movement is limited by the costs and temporal complexities of exchange, then the health of populations relies on deliberate policies, scheduled migrations, genetic repositories accessed across frames, and complex calendars that coordinate return visits in ways that smooth both biological and cultural exchange. But these mechanisms are risky. Migration breaks the local tempo and reintroduces the social accretion the pocket sought to avoid. The price, again, is relational: biological continuity in exchange for social participation. Human cultures have attempted variants of this trade for millennia in much humbler forms: monastic retreats, ascetic enclaves, knowledge cloisters. The novelty near a black hole is the scale and literalness of the temporal distortion. The slow pocket makes what used to be metaphor factual. That extremity clarifies ethical stakes that were always present but seldom had such force. Preservation as policy needs an architecture of responsibility: transparent selection processes, rotating cohorts, legal guarantees for those who stay outside, and governance designed to translate commitments across temporal divides. Without such an architecture, preservation slides into hoarding, care decays into. There are mitigations. Societies can design institutions that deliberately bridge tempos: temporal embassies that maintain staff in both frames, rotational residences that allow broader access to slow life, and distributed archives with nodes across a spectrum of gravitational potentials so that no single clock dominates. Technology can help, too. Standardized, self-describing data formats, robust physical artifacts readable without contemporary context, for example, isotopic markers, universal mathematical encodings, and energy-backed relays that ensure signal integrity despite redshift. But every mitigation is itself a choice about what to prioritize. Building a distributed archive is expensive, instituting rotational residency requires. Beyond logistics, there is an aesthetic loss that deserves to be named. Much of what humans cherish about life is not longevity, but the texture of shared experience, the small, repeated acknowledgments that reinforce belonging. A society that preserves itself by decoupling from the shared present risks becoming an archive of well-preserved loneliness, exquisite objects and traditions tended by hands that never hear the chorus of contemporaries. The slow clock may save a recipe, a hymn, or a genome, but it may also silence the improvisations, the mutations, the accidents of social life that make culture porous and living. Paradoxically, in insulating against entropy, one can become vulnerable to ossification. Perhaps the deepest cost is moral imagination. Choosing the slow beat is choosing a relationship to the future. Is the future a repository to be filled for unknown readers, or is it the continuation of a living conversation? The slow clock strategy favors the former. It assumes that conserving things for an eventual audience, if any, repays the social dissociation required to get them there. That is a defensible position in the face of catastrophic risk. But it is nevertheless a wager about what counts as ethical fidelity. Is one preserving for posterity or abandoning present duties in the hope of being vindicated by an inscrutable tomorrow? The slow clock's price cannot be tabulated in any single ledger. It appears as law-breaking contracts that fail when clocks disagree, as grief children who will grow up without a parent's touch because that parent chose to live where minutes buy centuries, as arrogance, cultures that hoard the future for their own elites, as humility communities that accept the sacrifice of vibrancy for survival. It is a bundle of small and large losses, technical and moral. And yet, there is no simple argument that the price is too high. For a species facing terminal threats, radiation storms, stellar upheavals, climate cascades, the option to buy subjective time might appear not just desirable, but necessary. The calculus then becomes agonizingly contextual. How immediate the threat, how narrow the permanence purchased, who stands to benefit, and how the decision is institutionally constrained. What matters, in any case, is clarity. The civilization that contemplates moving its heart into a slow pocket must also confront what it is willing to renounce: the laughter of neighbors, the messy forms of mutual obligation, the comfort of shared calendrical witness. Those are not trivialities. In the end, the slow clock pays out an unusual interest. It buys endurance against physical erasure, and it charges in social disconnection. The net value depends on the metric chosen. If preservation of some material substrata, DNA, technologies, codatus, is the goal, then the slow pocket is a remarkable tool. If the goal is communal continuity in its fullest sense, shared values enacted by co-present communities, then the tool can be corrosive. Science can map the gravitational contours, place the habitats, set the relays, and build the protocols. Philosophy, politics, and culture must decide whether the ledger that balances preservation against belonging tips in one direction or another. The slow clock is not merely an instrument of physics. It is, as much as any technology in human history, a moral technology, one that forces societies to reckon with what they will barter against the future. The most sobering lesson is not the mathematics of dilation, but the quiet human price. The slow clock can keep things from decaying, but it cannot guarantee that the things it saves will remain connected to the living stories that made them matter. That, ultimately, is the cost that must be counted before the decision to live out of tempo is made. What if the universe hid doors not merely between places, but between times? Apertures through which a moment could step out into an age, or an age could compress into an instant? That question sits at the beating heart of a more audacious speculation, that black holes might not be finalities but conduits, that the mathematics of general relativity hints at bridges and mirrors, wormholes and white holes, whose existence would permit travel not just across the map of the cosmos, but across its ledger of moments. The idea is deceptively simple on paper. Einstein's equations admit solutions more varied than the tidy black sphere picture popular culture has made canonical. The Schwarzschild solution contains an Einstein-Rosen bridge. A maximally extended manifold suggests, in formal terms, a connection between distant regions of spacetime. Under different mathematical dressings, singularities can be paired with time-reversed counterparts. What swallows might have an inverse that spews. Taken at face value, these are doors, and if a door connects two different times as well as places, the prospect is irresistible. Enter, and one might emerge not only elsewhere in space, but elsewhere in time. The technical scaffolding behind the notion is precise and constraining. Traversable wormholes, the kind that would permit passage of matter, were formalized in the late 20th century by theoreticians who asked what it would take to keep an Einstein-Rosen bridge from collapsing the instant anything tried to cross. The answer they found was stark. One must violate the ordinary energy conditions of classical matter. In other words, one must supply a kind of exotic matter with negative energy density, a substance that repels rather than attracts, a curvature of spacetime that resists pinch and collapse. Quantum physics, however, provides tantalizing hints that negative energy can occur locally. The Casimir effect between conducting plates produces regions of reduced vacuum energy, but scaling such effects from microscopic laboratory curiosities to even if the exotic energy problem could be solved, the next set of questions soon becomes ethical and metaphysical. A wormhole can be converted, in principle, into a time machine by moving one mouth relative to the other at relativistic speed or by exploiting gravitational time dilation. One mouth carried in the deep well of a black hole ages more slowly than the other, far from that well, and so synchronization breaks. Close the circuit and close time-like curves. Loops in the fabric of causality appear. These are no longer merely mathematical curiosities, they are a formal way to capture the idea of sending information or matter to one's own past. Once causality is pierced, paradoxes crowd the stage, the grandfather-like contradictions that haunted early debates about time. Stephen Hawking's chronology protection conjecture answered with a posture of cosmic modesty. Nature abhors time machines. It proposed that quantum effects grow without bound as a would-be time machine is formed, destroying the mechanism and protecting the universe's causal order. Rigorous proofs remain elusive, but the conjecture focused attention on a practical reality. The formation of stable, traversable time machines may be precluded by instabilities that cannot be engineered away. Quantum fields and curved spacetimes produce divergent stress energy as closed time-like curves are approached. The back reaction of this quantum energy could be the very force that snaps the would-be machine shut. There are further, less abstract dangers. The environment near a black hole is not merely curved space, it is an arena of violent gradients. Tidal forces. The variation in gravity across small distances can stretch and compress matter with inexorable cruelty. For small black holes, these gradients near the horizon are knives. For supermassive black holes, the gradients at the horizon can be mild, offering, in principle, a survivable approach. But survivability judged by tidal gradients is only one measure. Radiation fields near accreting holes generate torrents of high-energy photons and particles. Photons climbing out of deep potentials can be enormously blue-shifted for an infalling observer or conversely enormously red-shifted for a distant. This is why the question of actual travel through such hypothesized machines slides from engineering into the domain of metaphysics and cautionary ethics. No one knows, with empirical certainty, whether a living organism, much less a civilization, could traverse a wormhole and emerge intact into another time. The mathematical solutions are not moral calendars, they are careful landscapes in which singularities lurk where our physics falters. At the singularity, general relativity announces its own limits. Quantum gravity, the sought-for unification that would govern the Planck scale structure of spacetime, remains a horizon of theoretical work. Without a reliable theory of what happens to information, energy, and structure at the deepest scales, any claim about safe passage is provisional. Those provisionalities breed two very different human reactions. One is longing, the seductive idea that a civilization might step out of history's stream, re-entering a past to rescue endangered knowledge or leap forward to see outcomes of its choices. The other is dread, the recognition that temporal dislocation severs the human networks that give memory meaning. If time can be jumped, then the anchor points of responsibility, promises, stewardship, the obligations to future generations, loosen in unpredictable ways. Speculative scenarios sharpen the dilemmas. Imagine, for instance, the archive impulse writ, cosmic, repositories placed at the mouths of stabilized wormholes to preserve biological samples, cultural canons, or entire encoded minds in a region where proper time is slower. The idea is an extension of earlier reflection about black holes as slow pockets, but now with the added possibility of exit. Preservation via time dilation is attractive because it buys subjective time. It delivers an inner continuity against the external storm of cosmic events. But to rely on wormhole exits is to bet on stability and survivability of a kind that the current physics does not yet license. Another impulse is rescue, sending information back to avert catastrophe or forward to transmit knowledge ahead to descendants. This route collapses quickly into paradox. The act of sending a targeted signal into the past that removes the motivation for sending it in the first place is the archetype of causal contradiction. Physicists have proposed several responses. One is consistency constraints, solutions that, when fully solved, forbid paradoxical histories, allowing only self-consistent loops where actions in the past conspire to produce the future that sent the action. Another roots to quantum mechanics, invoking many worlds. An intervention in the past branches the universe into a new history. thereby avoiding paradox at the cost of multiplying universes. Both options, there are lesser known technical threats as well. Consider the blue shift problem for signals and matter. A signal sent through a wormhole throat can be amplified to enormous energies by the time it reaches the other mouth because of the gravitational potential differences or relative motion. This amplification can make what begins as a subtle encoding into a destructive blast. Worse, the accumulation of blue-shifted vacuum fluctuations in a would-be time machine can generate the same runaway back reaction that Hawking imagined, collapsing the geometry in a quantum fury. In physical terms, the very act of trying to build the machine supplies the seeds of its demise. Yet the theoretical door remains ajar. Advances in semi-classical gravity and holographic dualities suggesting that space-time geometry emerges from entanglement and in clever constructions of traversable wormholes and lower-dimensional toy models have shown that the universe is rarely as forbiddingly closed as early intuitions imagined. Holography, for instance, reframes horizons as surfaces that encode interior information in degrees of freedom distributed on a boundary. That language has led to proposals where the entanglement structure of quantum fields can be arranged to mimic a traversable throat. But these models are stylized, microscopic, or mathematically contrived, scaling them into macroscopic pathways for ordinary matter remains. Beyond the physics, there is the archaeology of speculation. For those who imagine deep human time, civilizations rising and falling across geological epochs, the temptation arises to ask whether lost cultures might have learned to harness such bridges. Could evidence be left adrift in the record? Unnatural isotopic ratios near ancient ruins, anomalous alignments of megaliths, or residues of technologies designed for impossible tasks? Such speculations intersect uneasily with the discipline's standards. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and there is, to date, no empirical sign of manufactured wormholes, white holes, or engineered time bridges. The more fruitful angle is philosophical. The possibility reframes the ethics of preservation. The answer, in the terms of a reflective documentary, is humility. The mathematics permits imagery that outstrips present capacity. The universe's equations are generous in their imagination and miserly in their concessions. They allow geodesics that form loops, surfaces that reflect information, and structures that can, in principle, connect seemingly disparate events. Yet the human life world is welded to contingency. Bodies must survive heat and shear, societies must maintain the institutional continuity to build and to guard, and moral frameworks must be invented to govern the deployment of such a world-altering technology. This observation has an emotional texture. Scientists feel the twin currents of seduction and caution. There is wonder in the conceptual leap, the sense that physics reveals that time is not monolithic but a malleable fabric. There is humility in the recognition that the gaps in knowledge are profound. Singularities remain a frontier. Quantum gravity is a promise not yet fulfilled, and the thermodynamic bookkeeping of information at horizons still causes heated debate. And there is a peculiar form of sorrow in the awareness that some strategies for preservation, the idea that one might, by a geometrical artifice, buy centuries for an archive, trade present fidelity for future possibility, that trade-off is if black holes are, in some contexts, functioning time machines, or if wormholes can be stabilized into effective temporal conduits, their true significance may be less as practical tools for hopping into the past or hovering over the future, and more as mirrors that force a culture to decide what it means to be situated in time. They provoke questions about intergenerational justice and about the forms of responsibility that civilizations owe to distant descendants. They challenge the myth that longevity and presence are coextensive. Very long survival can come at the cost of connection. Great reach can compound isolation. Finally, there is an aesthetic lesson woven through the speculation. The universe's capacity to complicate causality, to allow, in principle, the coupling and uncoupling of clocks, is an invitation to modesty. The equations do not promise easy routes to immortality, and they do not provide moral absolution for those who would attempt to bypass the duties of the present by hiding behind geometry. Whatever doors physics eventually reveals, the most important choices will remain human, whether to treat time as a commodity to be hoarded, as a resource to be stewarded, or as a shared fabric into which societies must weave their obligations. Thus, the idea of black holes as time machines is less a manual than a meditation. It is a reminder that the cosmos offers both instruments and limits, that theoretical possibility does not equate to ethical permissibility, and that the deepest questions are often not how to move through time, but how to live within its many scales with dignity, prudence, and a stubborn respect for the people who share some part of its fragile present. What if the galaxy were not first and foremost a catalog of places, but a careful, layered chart of times, a clockwork map in which coordinates denote not only where, but when, where each world marks a different hour on a vast cosmic dial? That image folds together two truths that science quietly insists upon: that time is not an indifferent backdrop, and that the geometry of space can be read, in part, as a geography of duration. To travel across the Milky Way in this sense is to travel between metronomes, to step from one planetary beat into another. The map of time is not merely metaphor, it is a practical, ethical, and imaginative project that would remake navigation, politics, and even what it means to promise a future. On such a map, gravity would be the ink. The lines drawn by cartographers would be isochrones, contours of equal proper time relative to a chosen reference. Around every mass, those contours bunch and spread. Near a compact object, proper seconds thin; far away, they widen. A planet around a red dwarf sits within a different band of the map than a world in the embrace of a supergiant's mass. A moon riding close to a gas giant lies in a local pocket where tidal influences modulate daily rhythms. A world in the shadow of a supermassive black hole ticks to a cadence that, when translated into the language of a distant civilization, reads as decades for every year lived by its people. The map, then, becomes a cartography of tempo, bands. Making such a map would demand instruments and concepts that scientists already practice in fragments. Pulsars, those precise celestial metronomes, provide a natural grid. Their steady ticks are used on Earth for precise timing and for detecting ripples in space-time. On a galactic scale, a network of pulsar beacons could form a temporal scaffolding. Observatories would chart gravitational potentials, measure redshifts of standard candles, and compile a lattice of time corrections. A galactic GPS, but one concerned as much with converting between proper times as with plotting trajectories. The discipline would be half astronomy, half chronometry, a hybrid of astrophysical cartography and the science of clocks, producing maps where contours. The practical consequences of treating the universe this way are immediate and profound. Movement between planets would entail more than fuel budgets and orbital windows. It would involve temporal translation. Boarding a vessel to cross a system's gravitational gradient would be like setting one's watch to a new time zone and finding that the new time zone runs on a different kind of second. Communication protocols would need conversion libraries that carry metadata about proper time. Contracts and legal texts would have to specify which clock they invoke. An image transmitted from a low-potential world to a station orbiting a compact mass would arrive redshifted and temporally thinned, requiring not only correction for light travel delay, but also an interpretive act of This is not merely engineering nitpicking. The social life of any polity that spans such a map would be shaped by tempo. Economies would learn to price time differently. There would be an emergent language of temporal finance, time arbitrage, in which goods, services, and promises carry different values depending on the clocks that adjudicate them. A genetic seed bank preserved in a slow pocket would be bargainably priceless for a civilization racing toward ecological collapse. A patent filed on a fast world market might expire by an external calendar before it is enforceable in the slower frame. Diplomatic relations, too, would gain a choreography. Embassies would not only translate languages and laws, but calibrate calendars, negotiating windows measured in different units. Contracts could add clauses specifying with. At the center of such a temporal map sits an obvious and unnerving candidate for control: the black hole. Supermassive, concentrated, and indifferent, a galactic center alters the beat of every neighboring world more radically than any planet-bound variation. Where other masses nudge duration by small fractions, a black hole sculpts clock rates on a scale that can bend decades into days and vice versa. It is the deepest well on the map, a natural pivot from which isochrones fan outward. In the language of cartography, the black hole is not merely a geographic anchor, it is a master dial. Whoever understands how to read its geometry and to position habitats and relays within its contour lines gains practical. That leverage can be defensive and preservative. Earlier meditations imagined a civilization that deliberately nests archives, biospheres, or living communities in the slow shadow of a massive well-to-by subjective continuity, to let their seconds be modest while the external universe accelerates. On the time map, these locales are islands of slow tempo, marked and labeled for posterity. They function like natural vaults, places where the metabolic and chemical processes that erode objects and memories run on a different timetable. The black hole's gravity is, on the map, a kind of preservative varnish. It does not prevent entropy, but it defers its social reckoning, stretching the ledger of stewardship. Yet the same capacity can be weaponized or monopolized. Temporal control at scale invites forms of governance that are unique to a temporally heterogeneous cosmos. Imagine, on the map, a polity that controls the principal nodes of time conversion: the relay stations, the pulsar registries, and the orbital niches that smooth communication between fast and slow bands. With that infrastructural authority comes the capacity to impose time tariffs or to ration access to slow niches. Deny a community access to a slow refuge, and the map's lines become instruments of marginalization. Grant exclusive access, and those lines become privileges stamped into the fabric of history. The political economy of the map would be less about land or raw energy than about access to enduring durations. Temporal inequality. Cartographic decisions would be contested for reasons that are both technical and moral. General relativity offers no preferred global slicing of spacetime. Any foliation of the map is a choice. Which simultaneity a civilization selects to be its standard time is political. A galactic council could standardize on a coordinate time anchored to remote pulsars, or to the inertial frame of the local standard of rest, or to a reference derived from the galactic center. Each selection privileges certain lifeways. Choosing the black hole's frame as normative would advantage those who live in its gravitational shadow while bending the calendars of peripheral polities into awkward conversions. To redraw the map is to reassign authority over futures. Map making would also have technical quirks that would animate new professions and institutions. Isochrone cartographers would produce multi-layered charts, surface maps showing climatic and geological data, orbital maps showing navigational hazards, and temporal layers overlaying the expected dilation factors, frame-dragging vectors, and signal redshift gradients. Navigation would become a problem of temporal sequencing. Route planners would optimize not only for delta-v and energy budgets, but for minimizing disruptive tempo transitions. Ships would require clocks that can switch between proper time regimes with verifiable integrity, and protocols would exist to certify that a timestamp attached to a document carries it. These technicalities bring with them psychological and cultural reverberations. The map of time would produce a new kind of jet lag, not just the physiological dislocation of crossing time zones, but a civilizational jet lag that complicates identity and memory. A society that regularly moves people between slow and fast bands would need cultural practices to reconcile mismatched experiences. Mourning rites, for instance, would become elaborate negotiations, who bears witness to whom when lifespans and subjective durations decouple. Religious practice, too, might adapt. Calendars anchored in planetary cycles would meet liturgies calibrated to black hole years. Myths would form about places where the hours run thick as molasses. Information itself becomes a commodity on the map. The redshifting and time stretching of signals mean that archival strategies must care for not only material decay, but temporal accessibility. An archive positioned in a slow pocket might preserve data intact for subjective ages, but that data risks being out of phase with the conventions and languages of potential readers outside. Conversely, an archive in a fast band can be plundered and transformed faster than its creators can consent. On the map, then, storage and communication nodes become nodes of stewardship, choices about what to preserve for whom and on which beat. At the deepest level, the map uncovers an ethical grammar that was invisible when time was treated as a unitary river. It asks what it means to hold obligations when the very definition of future varies by location. Intergenerational justice acquires a spatial component. To whom does one owe responsibility when descendants exist on other clocks? If preservation can be purchased with proximity to a black hole, who decides which cultures or species receive that purchase? If access is unequally distributed, temporal colonialism emerges as a distinct form of domination, one that secures the future for some at the cost of consigning others to accelerated oblivion. The black hole, as the map's central control, brings also a metaphysical layer into the politics of time. In previous parts of this meditation, the event horizon was compared to a ledger, the surface where information may be inscribed and later leaked. Perhaps in Hawking radiation, over timescales that dwarf civilizations. On the time map, the horizon is both a boundary and a registry, a place where pasts are held in suspended form, their release slow and uncertain. Whoever has the means to read, to interpret, or to delay that release holds a kind of custodial power over what counts as recorded history. That power is not a metaphorical neatness. It intersects with the physical information paradox, the tension between apparent loss and eventual conservation. The map of time highlights other, subtler constraints that any civilization must confront. For while gravity sculpts tempo, it does so with cruel arithmetic. The closer one comes to an extreme, well, the harder the engineering and the greater the hazard from tidal forces and energetic flux. Practical habitation requires supermassive scales and remarkable technology. The map, therefore, also reminds its readers of limits. To draw the isochrones is one thing, to occupy the zones they delineate is another. The map does not promise dominion, it reveals trade-offs. Choosing to live in a slow pocket buys subjective time at the cost of isolation, complexity, and moral dilemmas of selection. Finally, the map asks a modest, humane question: how to live together when clocks do not agree. The answer cannot be purely technical. It will require legal scaffolding that recognizes temporal pluralism. conventions for timestamping contracts, diplomatic norms for asynchronous obligations, institutions that distribute access to temporal refuge fairly, and cultural practices that cultivate the empathy required to honor promises across rates. It will demand humility and acceptance that no single foliation of spacetime is normative simply because it is convenient. The map of time invites a politics of accommodation rather than of imposition, a network of agreed conversions, mutual maintenance of relay infrastructures, and a shared commitment to preserve the possibility of. Viewed from this vantage, the galaxy's clock face is a landscape of possibility and constraint. Planets register different hours. Travel between them is movement not only across distance but across rhythm. Black holes are the great hands of the watch, turning slowly, marking intervals that dwarf human habit. The cartography that would arise out of these facts is not a map for conquest alone, but a manual for coexistence. How to negotiate mismatched durations, how to steward archives that transcend lifetimes, how to ensure that the map's lines do not become new borders of exclusion. The metaphors of navigation, sails, wells, dials, are apt precisely because they foreground choice and craft. To map time is to accept a craft of living, to decide where to. In the end, the map of time is both instrument and admonition. It offers tools for preserving and for planning, and it sets a stern moral test. Can a civilization design systems that respect plural tempos, that prevent the hoarding of long futures by the few, and that treat duration as a shared good rather than a private currency? The black hole at the center of the map is a reminder that the universe's geometry confers power, that seconds can be redistributed, and that with that redistributive power comes responsibility. The galaxy's hours are many. To live well across them will require not only technical mastery, but a politics and an ethic calibrated to the subtle art of translating between clocks. What if Earth were not simply a world twirling in space, but a single tick on a grand woven clock, a node in a lattice of time stretching outward and inward in every direction? What if, somewhere in that lattice, an intelligence watched the pale blue dot and saw not a present, but a later hour of its own history? Or what if the Watchers were not strangers at all, but future iterations of life that began here long before, mutated by eons into something both continuous with and alien to what it left behind? These are not mere fantasies for cinema, they are ways of asking what it means to occupy a position inside a timeline that is itself structured, manipulated, and read. The picture that emerges is unnerving in its intimacy. To be observed by another intelligence is to feel measured against a standard created after one's own moment. To be looked at by an entity in the future is to be, in effect, an exhibit in a later narrative of continuity. The thought draws warmth and cold at once. Warmth because it suggests continuity, that the arc of being can bow forward and glance back. Cold because it relocates agency and memory. The present becomes a set of traces that a later mind may interpret, repurpose, or consign to sterile storage. The distinction is moral as much as it is scientific. The existence of future observers would convert present acts. Technically, this scenario can be framed by the same physical scaffolding the previous sections have considered: gravity's ability to dilate, horizon's power to hide, and the many ways in which information can be stored, scrambled, and potentially recovered. A civilization that exists in the time equivalent of a vantage point, whether through relativistic travel, residence in a gravitational slow pocket, or technologies that exploit the emergent properties of space-time, might be able to receive with astonishing fidelity some of the signals that an earlier epoch broadcast. That civilization would not look across mere distance. It would, in effect, be reading a different calendar. Theirs would be a historiography that maps not only where things. The speculative consequences fracture into two families of thought. In one, the Watchers are future descendants, a literal continuity. Life on Earth threads forward across millions of years, passes through bottlenecks and radiations, and emerges by processes of biology, culture, and technological metamorphosis as observers who retain, in some form, an interest in the planet that birthed them. In the other, the Watchers are unrelated but temporally displaced intelligences, civilizations that developed elsewhere or elsewhere, whose temporal coordinates align with a later chapter in Earth's story. Both versions force similar anthropological and ethical reflections, but the textures differ. Descendants invoke questions of identity, of lineage. If they are descendants, the thought becomes a meditation on continuity and transformation. What does it mean to be the same across deep time? DNA mutates, languages drift, cultures fracture, and technologies reconstitute cognition. A mind that traces its genealogy to present humans would almost certainly be post-biological in large part, foldings of mind into different substrates, radical reshaping of values by new environments, and a shift in what counts as meaningful. Yet continuity need not be genomic alone. Patterns of concern, a continuity of moral attention to certain problems, a fidelity to particular narratives, an elaboration of a mythic lineage, could persist even as corporeal forms dissolve. The presence of future descendants watching the if the watchers are unrelated intelligences occupying what our calendar would call the future, their perspective is that of the alien archivist. They read Earth as a set of signals and fossils, as electromagnetic whispers, as isotopic anomalies, as cultural detritus. Their taxonomies would obey their own practical needs and moral frameworks. They might value different classes of evidence, the distribution of long-lived radionuclides, engineered artifacts that resisted erosive forces, or robust patterns that indicate deliberate structure. What matters here is that interpretation is not neutral. Reading the past is always an act of choice. A future alien historiography would select, emphasize, and forget, and in those choices it would exert a kind of retrospective. Both variants converge on a central ethical pivot. The possibility of being read by later minds changes the present's duties. If future observers will encounter traces of the present, then current decisions about what to preserve and how to preserve it are not simply about survival or vanity. They are acts of testimony. They are choices about who will be seen, which suffering will be documented, which languages will be stored, and which ecosystems will be curated as examples. The question is no longer merely whether a seed vault or archive will survive physical decay, it is whether the preserved materials will be intelligible, legible, and ethically contextualized for readers whose frame of reference differs profoundly from our own. The problem of intelligibility is deeper than it first appears. The preservation of raw data is one thing, the preservation of meaning is another. A future observer, descendant or not, may obtain an artifact but not the social system that renders it meaningful. The loss of rituals, tacit knowledge, and context can render even durable objects mute. That is why the project of legibility is as much a cultural engineering problem as a material one. It requires embedding metadata about context, about practices and affordances, about interpretive keys that do not assume shared languages or cognitive architectures. In practical terms, this means designing preservation strategies that anticipate alien hermeneutics, multimodal encodings, universals grounded in mathematics. The specter of observation from the future also reframes the practice of archaeology. Imagine not only archaeologists of the present digging for the remote past, but also the possibility of future archaeologists excavating the strata we now build. The remains of contemporary cities, the plastic residues, the isotopic fingerprints of industrial combustion, and even the deep fractures in biodiversity, all become the primary sources for far future narratives about who we were. That possibility should feel simultaneously humbling and urgent. Humbling because the future's account will inevitably be partial, shaped by survivability and chance. Urgent because some choices increase the fidelity with which our epic can be read. Durable inscriptions, sound archives with interpreting. A deeper ethical knot emerges when the watchers might be us, but so changed that recognition is ambiguous. Continuity implies obligations across generations. Those obligations are not easily discharged by actions that simply prolong physical traces. They require institutions that transmit interpretive competence, that maintain a lineage of caregiving across time, and that are robust to disaster. The responsibility becomes political. How should a civilization allocate the resources needed for multi-century or multi-millennial stewardship? How does it decide which stories to preserve? How does it avoid the moral hazard of privileging artifacts useful to elites or to a narrow set of future readers? These are questions about intertemporal. Then there is the paradox of observability itself. If a future civilization could observe the past with fidelity, would their presence be detectable in the present? Could anything in the present be adjusted in anticipation of future observation? The attempt to answer this risks entanglement with causality puzzles, and those were already canvassed in previous parts, where wormholes and closed time-like curves turned ethical dilemmas into loops. A practical difference is that, for most plausible technologies, observation from a later temporal coordinate does not allow direct alteration of the earlier epoch. Watching is possible in many hypothetical models where intervening is not. That distinction preserves one fundamental asymmetry of historical stewardship. The responsibility to future readers falls squarely. That asymmetry carries moral import. It transfers agency to those alive now, intensifying the ethical weight of choices about the environment, culture, and technological paths. Knowing that future minds, whether relatives of humanity or independent intelligences, may someday read the traces one leaves should alter how one treats living systems and how one designs transmissions intended to carry meaning across unfamiliar interpretive regimes. The impulse to think beyond immediate payoffs, to code knowledge into forms that survive geological processes, and to craft narratives that are resistant to misinterpretation becomes not eccentric idealism but a species-level duty. There are pragmatics as well. If the network of times is dense and read by sophisticated observers, then certain forms of behavior are rationally favored. Redundancy becomes vital. Dispersing archives across multiple gravitational contexts reduces the probability of total loss. Diversity of encoding formats. from the chemical to the electromagnetic, from fossilization-friendly structures to isotopic markers, increases the chance that at least one form of message will remain legible. And crucially, inclusivity in what is preserved matters. A record of elite achievements alone produces a brittle narrative. A record that samples widely across social strata, languages, and ecosystems produces a resilient archive that future readers can triangulate into a fuller picture. But caution must temper optimism. There is a temptation to treat the future as a spectator and to offload present obligations onto unknown readers. The hope that future successors will clean up present misdeeds is an abdication of responsibility. If the possibility of future observation is used to justify reckless behavior in the present, then the moral calculus collapses. Observation does not absolve, it amplifies accountability. The awareness that one's actions enter a ledger read later should sharpen, not blunt, present duty. Beyond ethics, the idea that some observers might be literally temporally distant versions of ourselves reframes identity. Identity over deep time is not a matter of sameness as much as it is a question of narrative continuity. Stories, practices, and the very norms that define flourishing must have mechanisms for transmission. Technology can help, but technology alone will not create meaning. Institutions and shared rituals do that work. The moral challenge is thus to cultivate forms of social life that make stewardship natural, educational systems that foster long-horizon thinking, political structures that institutionalize future-oriented obligations, and cultural habits that valorize patience as a form of justice. Finally, there is a kind of existential consolation in the notion that Earth is a node in a larger temporal network. To imagine being read by future intelligences, whether kin or stranger, is to allow one's present concerns to participate in a fuller conversation. It is a comfort against the nihilism of ephemerality and a warning against the arrogance that treats the present as absolute. The awareness that actions echo forward into interpretive contexts beyond one's lifetime invites humility and a reformulation of purpose. If nothing else, it reframes survival as an ethical project, a deliberate effort to be intelligible, to be fair in the selection of what is preserved, and to accept that the act of preservation is itself a moral stance. Place in the timeline, then, is not simply geography plus epic. It is a moral geography, an atlas of obligations and possibilities. Earth may indeed be a small point in a network of times, but smallness does not entail insignificance. The vulnerability of being a single node heightens the responsibility to be a careful, generous node, to leave records that speak widely, to protect ecosystems that sustain future readers, and to resist the temptation to offload the burdens of the present onto the imagined patience of the future. Whether watched by descendants who will call themselves kin or by strangers who will interpret our fragments as curiosities, the act of being read is an invitation to choose what story to make of the moment one holds and to remember that, if one could choose, where would one live? That question hangs like a single, sharp syllable at the end of all the mathematics and ethics and speculative architecture that has come before. It is a practical question and a moral one, an aesthetic preference and a political choice. Would an intelligence choose to inhabit a world where seasons accelerate and history flashes by? A place where civilization can watch its neighbors and futures bloom in rapid succession? Or would it anchor itself to the slow, patient margin of a black hole, trading synchrony with others for an intimate, extended present, each blink on the slow world corresponding to an entire era elsewhere? The question is not a parlor game. It refracts every theme that has been examined in the previous sections: the bending of clocks by gravity, the paradoxes of witnesses separated by decades and centuries, the possibility of using geometry as a refuge, and the unsettling thought that duration itself might be a quality to be designed and policed. The final choice embodies competing philosophies of value. It crystallizes what a civilization is willing to sacrifice for endurance, for curiosity, or for belonging. To imagine the choice is to attend, with intransigent attention, to the texture of lived time. The candidate who opts for a fast-time planet chooses variation. Such a world promises spectacle, rapid climatic swings, ecosystems that cycle through experiments of form and function in a humanly apprehensible interval, technologies that test quickly and fail quickly, political cultures that pivot, deliberate, and expire within a rhythm of months and years. For communities that prize adaptability, novelty, and immediate impact, the accelerated tempo is intoxicating. The emotional vocabulary that accompanies this preference is restless and eager, delight at the density of events, impatience toward inertia, a belief that life's meaning is amplified when more narratives are packed into the center. Practical life on a fast world reads like a film montage, agricultural strategies tuned for quick yields, education systems optimized for short training cycles, institutions that accept churn as part of their identity. The social rituals are built for responsiveness, fast elections, ephemeral arts, continual recalibration of value. This is not necessarily chaotic. Societies can build stability on a different axis. modular institutions that assume turnover, cultures that ritualize the ephemeral, legal frameworks that translate commitments into rolling, short-term mutual guarantees. In such places, the vaults and seed banks are not inert sanctuaries but active repositories of versions. Iterative. The fast world is also where the appetite for witnessing the cosmos finds fertile ground. An observer looking outward from a high-tempo planet sees other civilizations' centuries compressed into manageable intellectual intervals. The temptation to intervene, to nudge evolutionary trajectories, or to accelerate beneficial developments would be strongest in such a culture. That temptation carries moral risk. Intervention can be paternalistic. It can destabilize societies not prepared for rapid flux. It can create dependencies that degrade long-term resilience. The fast world ethos thus must temper curiosity with restraint or accept ethical volatility as an unavoidable feature of a life lived in high definition. The alternative, the slow pocket by a black hole, is a different moral experiment. Here, the architecture of life is patience transformed into civic competency. A community that chooses a slow edge does not renounce the galaxy, it reframes its relationship to it. Subjectively, days and seasons pass as they do in any steady environment. But the local present is slow relative to distant frames. 1 year at home equates to centuries beyond. The inhabitants become custodians, in the literal sense, keepers of living systems, technicians of repair, archivists of far future memory. Their institutions are built around durability, maintenance regimes that expect shifts over external millennia, apprenticeship models that pass. Emotionally, life in a slow pocket cultivates a different set of virtues. Patience hardens into practical wisdom. Fidelity becomes a public ethic. There is a serenity available to those whose worries do not compress into urgent screams but unspool into long sequences of small interventions. Yet serenity has a cost. The slow inhabitant knows that keeping an archive intact may mean that its immediate neighbors, friends, cousins, trading partners will age and die while the local hours merely inch forward. That realization shapes an effective landscape of bittersweet fidelity. The pride of stewardship sits beside the ache of being out of step with a larger social rhythm. The slow pocket seduces with its promise of survival. It offers refuge from cosmic catastrophes measured in the galaxy's quick time, supernovae, gamma-ray bursts, the restless mechanics of stellar neighborhoods. To live near a supermassive well is to buy a kind of temporal insulation. Yet to choose insulation is to choose distance. The slow sanctuary makes contact with the wider cosmos episodic and asynchronous. Messages stretch and redden. Diplomatic relations become protocols articulated in clauses that accept differing measures of soon. The political architecture must therefore invent principles for temporal reciprocity, ways to adjudicate obligations that span mismatched clocks, to translate promises such that they're more. Both choices, fast and slow, are not merely metaphysical preferences, but moral claims about what it means to matter. Do those who wish to be alive longer owe it to their contemporaries to remain synchronized, to be seen and mourned in real time? Or does the duty to future beings, whomever they may be, justify a withdrawal into a different tempo, preserving a genetic library or a cultural canon that will outlast current neighbors? The question fractures into sub-questions about justice and selection. Who decides what to save? Who gains access to slow refuges? Who bears the burdens of being left on a speeding world? Any honest answer must reckon with inequality. The technological threshold to approach a gentle gravitational seam, to build radiation-shielded habitats, to sustain orbit maintenance crews. These are expensive undertakings. That means that the choice to step into slow time cannot be divorced from power. A few could secure long futures while many remain exposed to fast calamities. A civilization that values fairness will therefore have to design access protocols, rotational residency, lotteries, ethical selection criteria that mitigate temporal hoarding. Without such mechanisms, the slow pocket becomes a new frontier of privilege. The wealthy buy time, the poor sell it. Yet the dilemmas cut both ways. Fast world practices can be extractive as well. Rapid turnover favors short horizons and can incentivize plundering commons for immediate gains. Markets and governance that prize short-term returns may undermine long-term survival. The fast tempo thus begets a different form of injustice, discounting the claims of future beings so steeply that their very existence is jeopardized. The moral architecture of any civilization must therefore balance the virtues of both tempos, curiosity and care, experiment and stewardship. A further axis of decision-making belongs to the intangible dimensions of meaning. Some actions are meaningful precisely because they are shared in time, because there are witnesses, because rituals can be repeated and observed together. To be present is to participate in the chorus of recognition that binds individuals into families, into nations, into moral communities. To be absent from that chorus is to risk becoming an unremarked relic. Preservation at a slow edge can save a thing, but it cannot guarantee that the thing will retain its social life, the practices, jokes, and contingencies that make an artifact intelligible. The slow archivist must therefore adopt hermeneutic humility, preparing records not merely as objects but as contexts, embedding key. There is also, layered over all these practicalities, a metaphysical tempering. The equations that undergird these scenarios remind the thinking mind that time is not a monolithic river but an arrangement of many currents. To accept that lesson is to move beyond either or. A civilization need not choose exclusively. Distributed strategies are possible and perhaps preferable. A lattice of habitats that spans a range of gravitational potentials, redundant archives spread across tempos, rotational exchange programs that keep gene pools and cultural repertoires alive, diplomatic frameworks that treat duration as a shared resource to be negotiated. In short, societies can build systems that tolerate plural tempos rather than. What then does it mean to live well in a temporally plural cosmos? It means designing institutions that honor asynchronous responsibilities. It means embedding equity into choices about who gets to slow down and who remains in fast time. It means crafting archives robust not only to chemical decay, but to semantic drift, ensuring that the preserved things also carry their interpretive frames. It means cultivating virtues suited to each tempo, flexibility and responsiveness where events are dense, patience and fidelity where years buy centuries. It means creating diplomatic norms that translate promises into commitments that persist across clocks, and legal regimes that recognize timestamp plurality without becoming tools of domination. There is a final, philosophical intimacy to the question that cannot be escaped. The decision of where to live is, at root, a declaration about what counts: the immediacy of shared human life, or the long, deferred testimony to unknown readers. It is a testament to what a society wants its name to mean when the dust of epochs has settled. Choosing the fast world is to say that being in the present colliding, experimenting, bearing witness in real time, defines meaning. Choosing the slow pocket is to say that ensuring a future record, even at the expense of synchronous belonging, is the highest duty. Time, in that sense, is revealed as a kind of value currency. It can be spent on participation or saved for posterity. It can be lent as a bridge across epochs or stashed as a private nest egg by the privileged. The physics shows that seconds and centuries are convertible in principle. The moral imagination must decide the exchange rate. And yet, for all the specificity of choices and protocols, there is a deeper, humbling truth, the sense that time is an illusion in the way that matters to human vanity. Not because time does not exist as an ordering of events, but because the notion of a single, universal present was always a comforting fiction. The cosmos never promised a uniform now, it delivered plurality. Once the illusion of a shared absolute present dissolves, human moral creativity is called to invent practices that sustain meaning across difference. If time is a fabric of many threads, then the task is not to weave everyone into one strand, but to learn the craft of translation, to make promises legible across tempos, to design archives that can be read by strangers in other hours. In the end, the final question remains neither solved nor morally neutral. It becomes, instead, an invitation. A civilization that asks where to live is being asked, in return, what it most wants to be remembered for. Will it prefer to be the civilization that watched many fast futures flicker by, whose members tasted the density of events? Or will it be the one that sat patiently by the edge, preserving a living present and trusting that someday someone, whatever they might be, will read their records and know that they once were? The answer will vary. Some communities will choose visibility, others will elect refuge. The wise will choose a mixture, keeping some lives synchronized in the messy present while safeguarding others in slow vaults, building a map of time that respects pluralities rather than flattening them, and creating moral protocols that guard against temporally gated privilege. Above all, the final lesson is a modest and penetrating one. Time might be negotiable, but meaning is not. The choice of where to live is also a choice about what matters. To live well, therefore, is to accept that duration is a resource to distribute justly between the pleasures of immediate participation and the duty of care to distant, unseen readers of the future. Time may be an illusion in the ancient sense of an absolute